We were driving along a narrow mountain road to a family gathering at my son's house when my wife suddenly grabbed my arm and said, "Turn the car around now." There was something in her voice I had never heard before. I didn't argue, I just listened. That decision saved our lives. Because in that moment, she saw something in our son that I didn't, and once I did, there was no turning back. Thanks for joining me. Before the story continues, take a second to subscribe, and let me know where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And just a heads up, parts of this story have been adjusted for storytelling, and any resemblance to actual names or situations is unintentional. Turn the car around, Philip, now. Martha's voice cracked like a dry branch, a sound so sharp it didn't even belong to the woman I had been married to for 40 years. 1 second, we were winding up the steep road toward the Sector 9 Highland parcel for a long-awaited family reunion, and the next, something in her tone made my blood turn to ice. I am Philip Bannerman, a 68-year-old former land auditor, with a gaze trained to measure stress points in every legal boundary I entered. But in that moment, I wasn't the one who saw it first. She was. I sat rigidly behind the wheel of my SUV, my knuckles white as the smell of damp pine and exhaust filtered through the vents. Beside me, Martha, a retired nurse who could spot a lie or a fever from across a parking lot, placed a cold, trembling hand on my shoulder. Her eyes fixed ahead, with a level of certainty I had learned never to ignore. The gravel snapped under my tires as we climbed higher into the thin air of the mid-state highlands. "Julian said everyone would be here by 2, Martha murmured, but her voice wasn't reassuring. It was searching, scanning for something that wasn't there. "Philip, where are the cars?" She added, quieter this time. I followed her gaze instinctively. She was right. There were no vehicles lining the shoulder, no signs of arrival, no movement. Just a silence that felt arranged. "You're driving like something's wrong," she said, her voice tightening no longer, questioning, diagnosing. I didn't answer immediately. I looked toward the dark clouds pressing low over the ridge, then back to the road ahead. As an auditor, I had spent decades identifying structural anomalies, places where something looked stable on the surface but was quietly failing underneath. But this wasn't my instinct speaking first. It was hers. A home doesn't just fall apart overnight. There are warnings, whispers, long silences, looks that don't meet your eyes. My family had been breaking for 12 years, and I was just too blind to see it. I had patched over the cracks, labeled them phases, stress, growing pains. But now, for the first time, I wasn't the one rationalizing. Martha leaned forward suddenly. "Philip there." Her voice dropped into something sharp and absolute. I followed her hand as she pointed toward a row of dead oaks lining the edge of the property. At first, I saw nothing, just shadow. Then my vision adjusted, and I saw it. A matte black heavy-duty truck, not parked, positioned, tucked into the shadows at an angle that allowed a clear line of sight to the road without exposing itself. My chest tightened as my mind began mapping intention instead of scenery. That wasn't coincidence, that was placement. And then I saw Julian, standing on the porch, not moving, not waving, not smiling. He held a thick industrial envelope in both hands, his posture rigid, his face completely still. There was no warmth in his expression, no recognition, just focus, like a man waiting for something to arrive on schedule. "Philip, look at his face," Martha whispered, her voice now stripped of all doubt. "That's not a son waiting for his parents." Her hand tightened on my arm. "And those men?" I shifted my focus back toward the truck. 2 figures moved in the shadows. Slow, controlled, not approaching, watching. "They're not carrying anything," Martha said, her breathing shallow now. "Philip, those aren't bags. Those are restraints." Something inside me snapped into place. Not fear, clarity. My son wasn't hosting a reunion. He was staging something. "Turn the car," Martha said again. No panic, no hesitation, just certainty. I didn't argue. I didn't question. I moved. The gear shift slammed into reverse, the tires screaming against the loose shale as I forced the SUV into a violent arc. Gravel exploded beneath us as the vehicle spun the horizon, tilting for a split second before snapping back into alignment. In the rearview mirror, I saw it. The truth. Julian didn't react. No surprise, no confusion, no anger. He simply turned his head slightly and nodded. Sharp, deliberate, like a signal already agreed upon. The truck behind him roared to life. The engine ignited with a low, predatory growl that cut through the stillness of the ridge. Headlights snapped on, flooding the road behind us in harsh white light. The two men moved instantly, not scrambling, not adjusting, executing. This wasn't a situation unfolding. It was one being activated. "Martha, hold on." My voice was steady. My hands were not. I slammed the accelerator. The SUV surged forward, tires clawing at the gravel as we shot down the winding road, the trees blurring into dark streaks on either side. In the mirror, the matte black truck closed the distance with terrifying efficiency, its engine built for terrain, like this built for pursuit. We weren't leaving a reunion. We were escaping something that had been waiting for us to arrive. The road twisted sharply ahead, hugging the mountainside in tight, unforgiving curves. My grip tightened on the wheel as every instinct I had spent decades suppressing surged back to life. For 12 years, I had convinced myself that the cracks in my family were manageable, that they could be patched, hidden, explained away. I was wrong. You can't stabilize a structure that has already been redesigned to fail. And as the engine behind us grew louder, one final truth settled into place. This wasn't desperation. This wasn't chaos. This was a plan, and we had just driven straight into it. The speedometer needle danced past 80 as the heavy grille of the Sierra filled my rearview mirror like a predator's jaw. I didn't breathe. I just gripped the wheel and prayed the suspension of my SUV held the curve. The road back down from Sector 9 was a serpentine nightmare of loose gravel and steep drops. A path I had surveyed 100 times during my years as a bridge inspector. I knew every structural weakness of the asphalt, every place where the mountain tried to reclaim the shoulder. Now that knowledge was the only thing standing between us and a lethal plunge. Behind me, the black truck surged forward, its engine screaming with a turbocharged fury that made the chassis of my own car vibrate. I felt the shockwave of its displacement before I felt the impact. They weren't just following us. They were hunting. The Sierra lunged, aiming specifically for my rear wheel well, with a precision that chilled my blood. They weren't trying to scare me into pulling over. They were trying to snap my steering to end our journey in a tragic accident before we even reached the valley floor. The entry twist was clear. Our lives meant nothing to the men behind that wheel. "Philip, they're not stopping," Martha shouted, her voice tight with a terror she usually kept reserved for her most critical patients. "He's going to hit us again." I glanced at her for a split second, seeing her knuckles white as she gripped the door handle. "Brace yourself, Martha. I'm taking the bypass over the old creek crossing." I jerked the wheel, sending the SUV skidding across the center line toward a deteriorating section of Ridge Road. Most drivers would have avoided this stretch out of fear for their axles, but I knew the banking was deep enough to hold a high-speed turn if you hit the apex just right. Metal screamed. Glass spiderwebbed. My world became a cage of vibrating steel, and Martha's shallow, terrified breathing. The Sierra slammed into our bumper, a bone-jarring jolt that sent us fishtailing toward the embankment. I fought the steering column, feeling the raw mechanical resistance deep in my palms. The smell of burning rubber and hot oil filled the cabin, a sharp industrial scent that signaled the car was reaching its structural limits. I managed to stabilize the drift just as we cleared the creek bridge, the sound of gravel pelting the underside of the SUV like a volley of gunfire. I looked in the mirror, watching the dust clouds billowing behind us, but the Sierra didn't falter. It recovered from the bridge jump with a heavy rhythmic bounce and surged back into my slipstream. These weren't local kids looking for a thrill. The way the driver maintained the line, the way he anticipated my swerves, it was clinical. They know how to drive. Philip, Martha gasped, her eyes fixed on the side mirror. These aren't just some local kids. I nodded, my jaw aching from the tension. They're professionals, Martha. Julian didn't just invite us to a party. He sold us to a pack of wolves. How many times had I inspected the guardrails on this very road, ensuring they were strong enough to save a life? Now, I was looking at them as the only thing keeping us from a 300-foot drop into the pines. I saw a narrow choke point ahead, where the mountain wall squeezed the pavement. I slammed my brakes, a sudden violent deceleration that I knew would catch a tailgater off guard. The Sierra driver reacted quickly, but not quickly enough. He swerved to avoid my bumper clipping the rusted steel guardrail. Sparks showered the road like a dying firework, and the black truck lost its momentum as its front fender crumpled against the barrier. For a moment, I thought we had won. I floored the pedal, feeling the engine groan under the strain, and put 50 yards of asphalt between us. But as I found a straightaway to gain distance, the triumph turned to ash in my mouth. The Sierra didn't stay back. It didn't stop to assess the damage. It pulled away from the rail, its headlights still level, and settled into a hauntingly consistent pace. It stayed exactly 40 feet behind me. Why aren't they passing us? Martha asked, her confusion mirroring my own. They have the horsepower. They could have rammed us off the road 10 times over by now. I looked at the road ahead, then back at the mirror. Because they don't want us stopped yet, I whispered. They want us exactly where they're waiting. The Sierra was a shadow, with teeth an apex predator that didn't need to bark because it knew exactly where the fence ended. They were herding us. To my right, a set of headlights appeared on a parallel access road, moving in perfect synchronization with our pursuit. We were being funneled toward a destination they had chosen long before I ever turned the key in the ignition. Strategic dread settled in my stomach, heavier than the G-forces of the turns. I knew the layout of this county like the back of my hand. If they kept us on this path, there was only one turnoff left before the road hit the main highway, and that turnoff led into the rotting guts of the timber country. My palms were slick against the steering wheel, the vibration of the column making my fingers numb. The timber gate loomed ahead, white and stark against the dark green of the trees. It was a massive weathered barrier made of old oak heartwood, and it wasn't supposed to be closed. It had been chained shut, blocked by a fallen timber trunk that looked far too deliberate to be a storm casual. It was a pre-staged trap, a structural wall meant to break our momentum and force us into the only opening left on the shoulder. As I yanked the wheel toward the gap, the SUV's tires screaming in protest, I saw the glint of a second black truck waiting in the dark of the sawmill entrance. Its engine was already running. My tires screamed against the damp earth as I dove into the darkness of the old mill, my headlights cutting through the dust of a decade. I wasn't just running from a truck anymore, I was driving straight into a grave. The SUV lurched as it left the asphalt, the suspension bottoming out on a rotted timber beam. Behind us, the timber gate remained white and stark in the rearview mirror, but the second black truck had already pivoted, cutting off the gravel neck of the sawmill entrance. I yanked the wheel, guiding us into the belly of the main structure, where the smell of dry rot and old diesel hung heavy in the air. I had inspected enough collapsing bridges to know the sound of structural surrender, and as I squeezed the SUV through a narrow loading bay intended for forklifts, the screech of metal against rotted cedar told me I was out of room. I found a pocket of absolute shadow near a defunct conveyor belt and doused the lights. The sudden silence was worse than the chase. The pursuit was never meant to capture us out on the road. The realizing of that truth made my stomach turn. They were hurting me, driving me toward this specific point of failure. It was a calculated elevation of my heart rate, a physical stress test, where the outcome had been rigged before I ever left my driveway. "Philip, you're breathing. You're turning gray." Martha's voice was a sharp clinical intrusion into the static of my panic. I could feel it then, a sharp stabbing pain blooming behind my ribs like a flare. My left arm went heavy, a phantom weight dragging me down into the seat. "I just need the pills. Martha, the console. Now." My words were thin, whistling through a throat that felt like it was closing. My heart was a frantic bird battering against a cage of bone, its rhythm erratic and dangerous. How do you tell your heart to slow down when the people who shared your DNA are waiting for it to explode? Martha's hands were a blur of motion as she fumbled with the center console latch. She was a professional, a nurse who had seen 1,000 cardiac crises, but this was different. This was her husband, and the wolves were idling their engines just 50 yards away in the yard. I leaned my head back against the headrest, trying to find the structural center of my own soul, while the SUV cabin felt like it was shrinking. The rhythmic thrum of the Sierra's idling engine outside vibrated through the floorboards, a predatory heartbeat that mocked my own. Martha frantically reached into the center console, pulling out the silver foil pack of my blood thinners. I heard the sharp, frantic crinkle of the sliced foil in her shaking hands. "Philip," she whispered, and the sound was more terrifying than the men with the zip ties. "They're gone. These aren't your meds. Someone cut the foil." I turned my head, the movement costing me more energy than I had. She held the pack up to the dim light, filtering through the mill's slats. Every single blister had been carefully surgically sliced from the back. The original tablets had been removed, and in their place were pills that were thicker, chalkier, and altogether wrong. I didn't need a lab to know the signature. Vanessa, she was in the kitchen, organizing the cabinets last week. I could almost see her manicured fingers moving through our pantry, her face a mask of daughter-in-law helpfulness while she prepared our execution. The foil pack was a silver butterfly, with its wings clipped a tiny monument to a son's greed and a mother's clinical cruelty. It wasn't a rush job. It was an execution planned weeks in advance right under our noses while we talked about the guest list for the reunion. Martha brought one of the fake tablets to her nose, sniffing it with a focused intensity. I could see the cold, chalky dust of the fake pills on her fingers. This is a common supplement, Philip. High-dose vitamin K. It acts as a direct antagonist to your medication. If you take these while your heart is under this much stress, your blood will clot in minutes. They didn't want a murder scene, Philip. They wanted a stroke. The wisdom of the trap was breathtaking in its malice. A natural death behind the wheel of a crashed SUV on a dangerous mountain road. No forensics, no questions, just a grieving son inheriting the Highland parcel. You see, that's the thing about family. They don't need to break down your door when you've already given them the key to your medicine cabinet. My anger began to burn through the fear, a cold, reflective heat that gave my hands a temporary steadiness. Then, I can't let my heart stop, I whispered, gripping the steering wheel. And I can't stop this car. I watched the family safety blue dot pulsing on my phone screen on the dashboard. Julian had insisted I install it so he wouldn't worry about us on the drive. It was the exact tool he was using to lead those black trucks directly to our throats. I realized the truth of our situation, then the blue dot was the tether and the sawmill was the slaughterhouse. Every move I had made to escape had been broadcast to the men in the Sierras with satellite precision. As the headlights of the first Sierra swept across our windshield, the beams cutting through the rotted wooden slats like searchlights, Martha didn't scream. She had spent too many years in emergency rooms for hysterics. She reached out, her eyes fixed on the massive logging truck, pulling out of the far gate across the yard, its trailer loaded with heavy oak trunks. She grabbed my phone with a decisive snap, her gaze meeting mine for a fraction of a second. I saw the nurse in her disappear, replaced by a woman who was ready to fight for her life. She threw the phone toward the open window, her eyes never leaving the movement of the heavy truck. I watched my digital identity leave me a glowing blue beacon of betrayal spinning toward the chassis of a moving 18-wheeler. It was a desperate gamble, a tactical diversion intended to blind the digital eyes that were currently watching my heart fail. The phone didn't just fall. It sailed through the open window, a glowing blue beacon of betrayal spinning toward the chassis of a moving 18-wheeler. I watched my digital identity leave me, hoping it would take our death sentence with it. Martha's hand was still outstretched, her fingers trembling slightly against the cold air of the timber yard. We watched in a suspended crystalline silence as the device bounced once off the gravel and wedged itself firmly onto the rusted metal frame of the logging truck. The driver of the big rig didn't even notice. He shifted gears, the heavy groan of the transmission echoing through the hollow mill structures, and began his slow, lumbering exit toward the main road. That phone, the very tool my son Julian had designed to monitor his aging parents under the guise of family safety, was now our only salvation. It was a power reversal I hadn't expected, a tactical pivot born of Martha's instinct. The blue light of the screen flickered one last time against the mud-caked tires of the trailer before disappearing into the shadows of the outer gate. As the logging truck pulled away, I realized the signal would now lead our hunters miles away, following a phantom trajectory toward the interstate, while we remained crouched in the dark. "Don't breathe, Martha. Let the signal do the running for us." My voice was a mere sandpaper rasp, barely audible over the settling dust. I reached out and cut the SUV's lights and engine with a practiced clinical speed. I knew the layout of this yard from a survey I'd done 20 years ago. I knew where the shadows were deepest and the foundations most solid. We were tucked behind a row of rotted cedar stacks, the smell of wet sawdust and old grease thick enough to taste. Silence is a heavy thing. It weighs more than the steel beams I use to inspect, pressing down on your lungs, until you forget how to swallow. We waited, the cold, damp air of the timber yard biting at my skin through the open window. Minutes felt like hours. Then the sound reached us, the aggressive, high-tuned whine of the Sierra engines. They weren't hiding. They were coming fast, their headlights scanning the yard, like searchlights in a prison break. I watched the beams dance across the rusted corrugated iron of the sheds, searching for the reflection of my paint or the heat of my exhaust. Two black Sierras tore into the yard, their tires kicking up plumes of gray grit. They slowed down, their predatory silhouettes crossing just 30 feet from where we sat. I could feel the physical sensation of the heavy engines vibrating through the ground, a bone-shaking rumble that traveled up through the tires and into my chest. One truck stopped so close I could have tossed a stone and hit the driver's door. I sank lower into my seat, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Through the gap in the wood stacks, I saw the driver. He was a man with a scarred jaw, his face illuminated by the cold artificial glow of a tablet mounted to his dashboard. He was checking the GPS. On that screen, the blue dot, the ghost of Philip Bannerman, was moving rapidly toward the interstate exit. He didn't even glance at the buildings around him. To him, the world was reduced to that digital pulse, and the pulse was running. "They're taking the bait," I whispered, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Look at the lead truck. He's not even looking at the buildings. They think we're panicking, Martha. They think we're running for the highway." With a sudden roar, both trucks peeled out their exhaust, coughing black smoke as they chased the logging truck into the afternoon mist. My son Julian had turned our love into a leash, and the GPS dot was the collar. But even a dog knows how to slip a collar if the master is cruel enough. Once the sound of their engines faded into a distant hum, I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding since we left the estate. The silence of the timber yard returned, but it was different now. It was the silence of the off-the-grid, the quiet of the legally dead. Martha reached over her hand, cold but firm, as she grabbed my wrist to check my pulse. "Your heart is hammering, Philip," she said, her nurse's eyes fixed on my face, even in the gloom. "We need to find a way to flush that vitamin K out of your system. You're walking a tightrope without a net." I looked out at the abandoned machinery scattered across the yard, rusted skeletons of an industry that had long since moved on. Julian's character felt like that broken steel hollowed out by greed, left to rot while he chased a shiny new future built on the wreckage of our lives. "The phone will buy us time," I replied, my voice gaining a hard, reflective edge. "But Julian isn't stupid. He'll check the highway cameras eventually. He'll see a logging truck instead of an SUV, and he'll know we've doubled back." Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be a ghost while you're still breathing? To watch the world hunt for a version of you that no longer exists? We were safe for the moment, but the victory felt bittersweet, like ash in my mouth. I had spent my life keeping people safe and bridges standing. Now, I was just a terrified husband, praying we could disappear into the trees before my own heart gave out. I reached into the glove box, my fingers searching for the emergency medical kit I always kept there. My stomach dropped. The small plastic orange bottle of my actual blood, thinner as the ones that could counteract the thick, sluggish weight in my veins, wasn't there. I remembered the rush, the panic at the estate when the first Sierra appeared. I'd left them on the kitchen island. I had the fake pills Vanessa had planted, and I had the ticking clock in my chest, but the real cure was 10 miles away in a house full of wolves. I turned the key, the engine groaning in the dark. We were invisible now, but I could feel the thickness in my blood, a ticking clock that didn't need a satellite to find me. The rusted doors of the old sawmill creaked open like a scream I had been holding in for 30 years. There is a specific kind of cold that doesn't come from the Pennsylvania winter. It is the frost that settles on your bones when you realize your own son has calculated the exact moment of your death. I guided the SUV into the cavernous belly of the mill, the headlights cutting through layers of suspended dust before I cut the power. We sat there in the sudden absolute dark, the only sound the rhythmic drip of rainwater through the mill's rusted roof, and the cooling metal of the engine ticking like a countdown. My chest felt tight, the blood in my veins moving with the heavy, sluggish consistency of wet cement. I reached for the center console, my fingers clumsy as I pulled out the silver foil pack Martha had described. In the dim gray light filtering through the slats of the mill, the truth looked even uglier. These pills were not placebos. They were active medical assassins specifically chosen because they leave no trace of foul play in a standard autopsy of a heart patient. Julian hadn't just sabotaged me. He had engineered a perfect natural-looking erasure. Martha reached over her movements, possessing the practiced efficiency of 40 years in white scrubs. She took the pack from me, her thumb scraping against a pill's chalky white surface. I watched her, the gray light catching the deep lines of worry on her face. "Philip, look at me," she said, her voice dropping into that clinical tone she used for the terminal cases. "If you had swallowed these when your chest tightened back on the road, you would be a statue in the driver's seat by now. It is high-dose vitamin K. It doesn't just block your meds, it turns your blood into cement." The chalky, bitter scent of the crushed tablet reached my nose, a smell that will forever be linked to the image of my son's smiling face at the estate. Trust is like a bridge truss. You can replace a few rusted bolts, but once the main girder is cracked, the whole structure is just waiting for a heavy wind to come along and prove it is a lie. I had been replacing bolts for Julian since he was in diapers, never realizing the girder had been rotten from the start. The meticulous nature of this betrayal triggered a memory I had tried to bury under a layer of fatherly denial. 5 years ago, Julian had come to my home office, his eyes red and his hands shaking. "Dad, I am drowning," he had said, leaning over my desk. "This logistics certification is the only way I can keep my contracts. Please just one last lift." I remember the weight of the checkbook in my hand. I remember the $20,000 I drained from the savings Martha and I had built for our quiet years. "I'm doing this for your future, Julian," I had told him. "Don't let me down." He had hugged me then, a long, firm embrace that I had mistaken for gratitude. Months later, a stray credit card statement revealed the truth. There was no course, no certification. There was only a lavish resort vacation in the Maldives for him and Vanessa. How many times can a man look at a lie and call it potential before he admits he is just an architect of his own destruction? I had built his life out of my own sacrifices, and he was using those materials to build my coffin. I stared at the fake pills in the dim light of the mill, the metallic taste of old regret sharp in my mouth. Julian didn't just want money anymore. He wanted the clean slate that only a dead father could provide. He wanted the Highland parcel, and he wanted the life insurance, and he wanted me gone, so he never had to look at the man who knew exactly what he was. Martha shifted in the passenger seat, her gaze suddenly snapping toward the floorboards. She reached into her nurse's emergency kit, but she didn't pull out a stethoscope. She pulled out a small handheld frequency sweeper she'd kept since the hospital had those stalking incidents. "Philip, wait," she whispered. The device chirped a low, persistent electronic pulse that made my hair stand on end. She stepped out of the car, kneeling in the grit and oil of the mill floor. Under the rear bumper, hidden behind a layer of mud and road salt, she found it. A hardwired GPS beacon tucked into the wheel well. The phone diversion had been a clever trick, but it was only a partial solution. They had a second way to find us. Every time I helped him, I was just buying the rope he is using to hang us now. The vitamin K wasn't a warning. It was a period at the end of a sentence Julian had started writing years ago. He had known I would run. He had known I would stress my heart. He had known exactly which bottle I would reach for in the dark. As Martha yanked the magnetic tracker from the wheel well, the cold, gritty texture of the mud staining her hands, I saw the twin beams of light. The second black Sierra was turning back from the interstate road, its headlights scanning the tree line with a slow mechanical hunger. They hadn't followed the logging truck for long. They had checked the hardwired feed and realized the ghost was still in the woods. I felt the fire starting to burn in my chest again, but this time, it wasn't just the vitamin K. It was a cold, white-hot clarity. My son thought he was the only one who knew how to use a map. He forgot who taught him how to read the terrain. I reached down and gripped the wire of the tracker, feeling the vibration of the electronics through my fingertips. I ripped it out, the sparks mirror imaging the fire in my soul. We were out of medicine, out of friends, and nearly out of time, but we weren't out of road yet. I extinguished the headlights, plunging us into a world of ink and pine. If Julian wanted to hunt us like ghosts, I was going to show him exactly how invisible a man with a surveyor's map could be. The metallic sting of the sparks from the ripped tracker still burned in my palm as I dove into the darkness of the old mill. I wasn't just running from a truck anymore, I was driving straight into a grave. The jagged end of the cable bit into my palm, but I didn't feel the sting, only the cold adrenaline of a man who had finally stopped playing the victim. We were sitting in the mouth of a fire road that didn't exist on any GPS, a narrow scar of mud and shale that I had helped grade 40 years ago. Martha was silent beside me, her silhouette barely visible in the dark. I reached into the glove box to find a rag for my hand, but my fingers brushed against something else, a crumpled slip of thermal paper. I smoothed it out against the dashboard. It was a receipt from a high-end electronics firm in Philadelphia, dated just 4 weeks ago. It wasn't for business supplies. It was for a long-range thermal imaging kit and 3 encrypted wireless beacons, all billed to my personal line of credit. The $20,000 I thought I'd lent Julian for his career hadn't been a loan. It was a down payment on the hardware he was currently using to track me down. The realization was a physical blow. A secondary collapse in a foundation I already knew was beyond repair. "Keep your window down, Martha. Listen for the sound of the creek. If we pass it, we've gone too far west." My voice was low, a surveyor's directive. I eased the SUV into gear, the tires crunching over hidden roots and wet hemlock needles with a rhythmic bone-deep vibration. Navigating these backwoods without lights is like trying to read a blueprint by feeling the ink with your fingertips. You have to trust the texture of the earth more than your eyes. I felt the incline of the ridge through the seat of my pants, measuring the pitch and roll of the vehicle against the memory of the topographical surveys I'd memorized decades ago. Every time the chassis groaned over a rock, I felt a corresponding spike in my chest, a reminder that the medical clock was still ticking. Martha leaned out the window, her hair whipping in the cold, damp air. I see the old fire tower silhouette. Philip. We're on the right track. She was being my eyes her nurse's focus, shifting from monitors to the charcoal outlines of the forest. We moved at a snail's pace, a shadow crawling through shadows far beneath the line of sight of the main road, where the Sierras were likely still patrolling. The slow, treacherous drive forced a heavy silence that I could only fill with the debris of my own regrets. I thought about that check I'd signed 5 years ago, the one I'd handed over in my home office with such a sense of paternal pride. I thought I was saving him, Martha. Every check I wrote was just another nail in our coffin. I could see the ink in my mind, the sweeping curves of my own signature, authorizing my own destruction. I had viewed those loans as a bridge to a better life for Julian, a way to shore up the structural flaws I saw forming in his character. But you can't reinforce a pillar made of sand. We didn't raise a son, Philip. Martha whispered, her voice reflecting the same bitter grief I felt. We built a monster and called it potential. At what point does a father stop being a provider and start being a victim? Is it when the first lie is told, or when the first pill is swapped? The distance between me and Julian wasn't just the miles of forest we were currently traversing. It was a decade of ignored stress points and willful blindness. I had been a bridge inspector who refused to see the rot in my own house until the roof was already touching the floor. We emerged from the thickest part of the woods, the trees thinning out as we reached the overlook of the valley. Below us, the lights of the town were a scattered handful of diamonds, but I was looking for only one beacon. There it is. Audrey's place. The only house on this ridge with a foundation I still trust. My daughter's home sat on an isolated spur, a sanctuary of cold logic and hard numbers. But even as I felt the first surge of relief, the sky above us finally broke. A violent lightning strike ripped through the darkness, illuminating the valley in a harsh strobe-like white. The lightning didn't just light up the sky, it exposed the rot. It showed us exactly how far we had fallen. For a split second, the world was as bright as noon, and I saw the jagged edges of the ravine we had just skirted. I knew that by bringing ourselves to Audrey's door, we were bringing the war to her. Julian wouldn't stop at the driveway. He'd seen her as an obstacle for years, a sister who asked too many questions about the family accounts. Once we crossed that threshold, Philip, there's no going back. Martha warned, her hand resting on my arm. Her protective anxiety was a heavy weight, a counterbalance to the desperate hope that Audrey could help us find a way out of this legal and medical maze. I steered the SUV down the final descent, the tires slipping on the rain-slicked shale. The smell of ozone and crushed hemlock needles filled the cabin as the first heavy drops of the storm began to pelt the roof. I pulled the SUV into the shadow of Audrey's porch, the engine dying with a final exhausted shudder. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain. I looked across the street, my surveyor's instinct picking up a shape that didn't belong on a residential utility pole. A small matte black housing was clamped to the wood, a cold red eye of a lens, pulsing with a slow mechanical hunger. It was a hidden camera I hadn't installed, a piece of the high-end surveillance kit I'd probably paid for with that $20,000 loan. The metallic taste of fear returned sharp and biting. Julian hadn't just followed us. He had anticipated us. He had mapped our escape routes before we even knew we were running. We weren't safe. We were just in a different room of the same trap. I looked at Martha, and in the faint red glow of the surveillance light, I saw the same realization in her eyes. The hunt wasn't over. It had just moved indoors. The front door creaked open, and for a second, my daughter's face was the only thing in the world that didn't feel like a lie. But even as she pulled us into the warmth, I could see the steel in her eyes, the kind of look a woman gets when she has been fighting a war alone. My daughter, Audrey Bannerman, 34. A forensic accountant who dealt in cold numbers and hard facts, opened her door and didn't even act surprised to see us. She looked at our rain-soaked clothes and the tremor in Martha's hands with a clinical gaze that quickly shifted to the street behind us. "Move," she whispered, her voice a sharp instrument. "Get inside before the sensors trigger another log." She didn't hug me. She didn't ask if I was okay. She simply grabbed my arm and hauled me across the threshold, her other hand already reaching for the heavy, metallic, reinforced deadbolt. The click of the lock was final, a heavy sound that echoed through the small entryway like a gavel. Audrey started checking the monitors, but it was Martha who grabbed my shaking hands. "Philip, look at me," she said, her nurse's instinct cutting through my panic. "We aren't just running anymore. We are fighting. Audrey checked the back door sensors now. Inside the house didn't smell like a home. It smelled of rain-soaked wool and the sharp acidic scent of Audrey's strong coffee. Audrey moved with the efficiency of a soldier, closing the blackout curtains and checking a monitor mounted near the door. "Don't stand near the windows, Dad," she warned, her eyes never leaving the screen. "I've had the curtains reinforced for a reason." "You knew, didn't you?" I asked, my voice sounding hollow, even to my own ears. "You knew he was coming for us." Audrey finally turned to look at me, the cold blue light of the monitors reflecting in her glasses. I didn't know the date she said, but I knew the math. And Julian's math always ends in a zero-sum game. I watched her walk toward her dining room table, which had been converted into a tactical command center. Files were spread across the surface in a way that reminded me of my own bridge inspection reports, but these were financial blueprints. The transition from the terrifying darkness of the fire roads to the sterile, organized safety of Audrey's living room was jarring. Audrey's house didn't feel like a home. It felt like a bunker built out of spreadsheets and spite. It was the only logical response to a brother like Julian. She reached into a stack of folders and pulled out a document stapled to a bright yellow cover sheet. "This is why I've been off the grid, Dad. This is what Julian tried to do to me 6 months ago." She handed me the papers. It was titled Renovation Waiver, a seemingly standard form for home improvements. As a forensic accountant, Audrey had caught the fine print that Julian assumed she would skim. It wasn't a waiver at all. It was a legal trick to place a primary lien on her own property to cover his business expansion. He told me it was just a formality for the contractor insurance, Audrey said, her voice tight with a suppressed fury. "If I hadn't read page 14, he'd own my roof by now. He tried to steal your home while smiling at your Thanksgiving table. I felt a new kind of bile rise in my throat. I realized then that Julian's predatoriness wasn't limited to his aging parents. He was systematically trying to cannibalize the entire family's assets one signature at a time. Have you ever looked at a document and realized it was a blueprint for your own homelessness? Julian didn't use a crowbar. He used a fountain pen. I stared at the crisp, sharp legal paper, the ink looking like a series of tiny black traps. The revelation forced me into a painful memory from 3 years ago. We had been at the lake house, the sun setting over the water, and Audrey had pulled me aside. She had found early red flags offshore shell companies registered in Julian's name, weird transfers from my retirement account that Julian claimed were clerical errors. I remember the way I had silenced her. I had told her she was being too clinical, that Julian was family, and family deserved the benefit of the doubt. I had called her cynical when she was just being honest. "I'm sorry, Audrey," I whispered the words, feeling heavy and inadequate. "I should have listened to you at the lake house. I was the architect of this disaster, wasn't I? My refusal to acknowledge Julian's rot allowed it to spread until it threatened our lives. Apologies don't fix structural failure, Dad," Audrey replied, though her tone softened slightly as she looked at my exhausted face. "But data might." She gestured to the monitors. "I haven't just been hiding. I've been building a evidence file on Julian's finances for months. I knew the day would come when his greed outpaced his patience. I just didn't expect him to hire professionals. You want to know the real cost of keeping the peace? It's the interest you pay on a lie until it bankrupts your soul. I had spent 12 years painting over the rust in Julian's character, thinking I was preserving the structure of our family. Instead, I had just made the eventual collapse more lethal. I picked up the fraudulent waiver again, my eyes scanning the bottom of the last page. That was when I saw it. A familiar notary stamp was pressed into the paper, the purple ink slightly smudged. I recognized the name immediately. It belongs to a family friend, a man I've known for 30 years. My God, Audrey. Julian didn't do this alone. He's got the notary in his pocket. This means his network of corruption is wider than we thought. He isn't just a desperate son. He's a local infrastructure of fraud. The realization that our entire social circle might be compromised made the walls of the bunker feel thinner. Audrey leaned over the desk, the hum of the computer fans filling the quiet room. She tapped a few keys, her face pale in the glow of the monitor. The waiver was just the bait, Dad. That was the small play. While you were focused on the party, I was tracking the land registry. Look what he did to your Highland parcel file. The cursor blinked on the screen like a pulse, a digital heartbeat for a crime that was already in progress. I leaned in, my heart hammering against my ribs as the screen flickered to life. The cursor blinked on the screen like a pulse, a digital heartbeat for a crime that was already in progress. I stared at the high-resolution digital ink, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. The screen didn't just show numbers, it showed a ghost. There, listed under a certified death record dated 2 weeks ago, was my own name, Philip Bannerman, deceased. The cause of death was listed as a myocardial infarction, signed off by a county coroner I'd never met. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they brushed the cool glass of the monitor. High-dose vitamin K. I whispered the clinical horror of Task 2.2 finally finding its legal anchor. He didn't just want me gone, Martha. He had already buried me on paper, utilizing a high-resolution scan of my professional stamp to forge my digital signature on insurance applications 3 years ago. This was the entry twist that turned our flight into something far more macabre. I wasn't just being chased by hired muscle. I was legally a non-entity. In the eyes of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, I was a corpse. It meant the men in those black Sierras could pull a trigger in broad daylight, and there would be no missing persons report to file. You can't murder a man who is already dead. Audrey's fingers flew across the keyboard, her face set in a mask of grim determination as she navigated the quiet title action Julian had initiated. He didn't just steal the land, Dad, she said, her voice dropping into a register of pure forensic fury. He erased you. He filed this forged certificate along with a fraudulent will to transfer the Highland parcel to a shell company called Ridgecrest Holdings. You're a legal non-entity, and the property is already in the final stages of liquidation. I sank into the chair behind her, the weight of the betrayal pressing down on my chest harder than any heart condition. I saw that truck, Audrey, a month ago. I thought I was being paranoid, but he's been measuring my grave for weeks. Have you ever looked at your own death certificate and realized the signature at the bottom was written by the person you taught to tie their own shoes? It is a question that defies logic, a structural failure of the soul that no amount of engineering can fix. My son hadn't just tripped into greed. He had built a cathedral to it, and I was the sacrifice at the altar. The sight of those digital records triggered a memory that had been itching at the back of my mind for weeks. It was a Tuesday nearly a month ago, around 3 in the morning. I had woken up to get a glass of water and looked out the front window of the Bannerman home. There, idling at the very end of the driveway with its lights extinguished, was a matte black truck. I remember seeing the silhouette of a man standing near the edge of our property. The faint flash of a camera lens capturing the foundation of the house and the exterior sensors of our security system. At the time, I had woken Julian to tell him. He had just laughed it off, leaning against the doorframe with a sleepy, practiced ease. "It's just the cable company, Dad. Don't be so dramatic. They're probably just updating the line maps." I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. Utility workers don't work in the dark with their lights off, Julian. I had countered, but I let the suspicion die because the alternative was too monstrous to contemplate. Now I realized he hadn't been protecting my peace. He'd been hosting the recon team. The ink on the paper was dry, but the betrayal was still bleeding. The silence of the office was shattered by the sharp, rhythmic chirp of Audrey's phone. It was an unrecognized number, but we all knew who it was. Audrey hit the speakerphone, her hand steady even as mine shook. Julian's voice filled the room, but it wasn't the voice of my son. It was flat, clinical, and transactional, the sound of a man closing a deal. "I hope you're comfortable, Audrey," he said, his tone devoid of any familial warmth. "You're making this very difficult for Vanessa, Dad. She doesn't have my patience. We know exactly where you are. The folder you took from the SUV, the original Highland survey, needs to be delivered to the drop point near the old trailhead by dawn. If you're stubborn, Leo will be the one who pays the price for your nostalgia." The protectiveness I felt for my grandson flared into a murderous rage, a heat that finally burned away the last of my shock. "If you hurt that boy, Julian, there isn't a hole deep enough in Blackridge to hide you from me," I growled into the phone. But Julian didn't flinch. Julian's voice was a scalpel peeling back the last layers of my fatherhood, until there was nothing left but the raw, stinging nerves of survival. "I'm looking at you right now, Dad," Julian whispered through the speaker, and the hair on my arm stood up. Audrey really should have updated the firmware on her porch camera. The exit twist hit us like a physical blow. The small red light I had seen outside wasn't just a recording device. It was a live feed. He was watching us in real time, savoring the look of terror on our faces, as we realized our sanctuary was just a transparent box. "Vanessa says the boy is getting tired of the basement." Julian added the static of the line, making his voice sound like it was coming from underground. "You have 4 hours. Don't make me prove how much I've changed." The line went dead, leaving us in a state of high alert panic. I looked up at the corner of the ceiling. my eyes searching for the tiny lens I knew was hidden there, staring directly into the eye of the monster I had raised. The rhythmic ticking of a clock on Audrey's wall seemed to accelerate each second a hammer blow against the deadline. We weren't just being hunted, we were being performed for, and the final act was set for sunrise. I looked up at the corner of the ceiling, staring directly into the lens of the camera like I was looking Julian in the eye. I stared into the black lens of that porch camera and felt my soul strip bare. It wasn't just a piece of tech, it was my son's eye cold and unblinking, watching his father realize he'd been living in a curated cage. For 68 years, I had walked this earth believing I was the surveyor, the one who measured the world. Now, I was the specimen under a microscope. Audrey didn't waste a second. She moved to the router, with a cold, frantic energy ripping the power cord from the wall. The static charge smell of the router after it was pulled lingered in the air like ozone after a lightning strike. The little green lights flickered and died, and with them, the red eye of the porch camera winked out. Audrey's fingers flew across her keyboard as she opened her laptop. "He's been inside my network since Christmas, Dad," she muttered, her face pale in the cold blue glare of the monitor. "Every file I thought was private. He's already seen it. He installed a remote access Trojan on my firmware. He wasn't just watching us, he was living in our pockets." "Cut the power, Audrey." I growled, my voice a jagged rasp of anger. If we can't see him, he doesn't get to see us bleed. Click. The router went dark. The red eye died. But the feeling of being watched, that's a stain that doesn't wash off with a power cycle. I stood in the center of the living room, feeling the invasive dread crawl over my skin like insects. Every email, every family photo, every login I'd ever used Julian and Vanessa had curated them all to build this mastermind narrative they were using to erase me. I suddenly remembered the blue folder. It was supposed to be safe in the false bottom of my briefcase locked inside the SUV. I needed to see it. I grabbed my keys and headed toward the front door, but Audrey caught my arm. "Use the garage door, Dad. Stay out of the line of sight." I slipped into the garage, the rhythmic drumming of rain on the metal SUV roof outside, creating a hollow, percussive sound. I fumbled with the latch of my briefcase, my fingers clumsy. My son was a scavenger picking through the bones of my career to find the one map that would let him sell the marrow. The false bottom felt too light. I yanked it open. The Highland Survey, the original stamped topographical maps that defined the boundaries of the parcel, was gone. "He didn't just hack us, Audrey," I said as I stumbled back into the kitchen, the empty folder dangling from my hand like a dead bird. "He was in the car. While we were in the sawmill, distracted by the pills Julian must have slipped in. He didn't just want me dead, Philip. He needed the original surveyor's marks to validate his forgery. He needed my hands to sign the deed before I went, or at least the physical evidence that I had." I sat at the dining room table, the hollow, papery sound of the empty document folder echoing my own internal vacuum. Martha sat across from me, her eyes red-rimmed, but her jaw set firm. The betrayal was so absolute it had moved past the point of pain and into a territory of clinical calculation. I reached for the documents. Audrey had pulled up the digital copy of the death certificate. How do you fight a man who has already buried you in the eyes of the law? You become the ghost that haunts the courtroom. I spread my remaining maps out, the ones Julian didn't think mattered. My bridge inspector's mind began to work, searching for the stress point, the one structural flaw Julian had overlooked in his hurry to be rich. I saw it then. The certificate was stamped with a time of death 2:14 p.m. At that exact moment, I was executing the high-speed U-turn and the GPS diversion we'd recorded on the interstate dash cam. The physical reality of my survival contradicted the digital lie of my death. He built a perfect bridge of lies, but he forgot to check the foundation. I whispered, a cold resolve finally settling over me. This time stamp. It proves I was alive when the death was recorded. "Then we don't just hide," Dad, Audrey said, her voice matching mine in steel. "We provide the proof." I held the forged certificate up to the light, and that's when I saw it, a smudge of ink on the notary's seal that didn't belong. It was a slight blur, a characteristic bleed I recognized. I looked closer, my surveyor's loop bringing the forgery into sharp focus. The stamp was signed by Benjamin Vance, a man we'd known for 30 years, a regular at our Sunday barbecues. My son hadn't just corrupted himself. He had turned our community into a syndicate. The realization that our family friend was the one who had legally erased me was a secondary fracture in my heart. Just as I was about to speak, a sharp metallic chirp erupted from the silence. It was the notification sound from Audrey's phone sitting on the granite counter. We all froze. The thumbnail on the screen showed a video message. It was a still shot of a windowless room, gray concrete walls lit by a single harsh bulb. In the center of the frame was a small wooden chair, and on it a boy whose small frame was shaking. Leo, my grandson. The bar below the video began to fill as the message downloaded. The progress bar was an agonizing crawl, a countdown to a heartbreak I wasn't prepared for. Martha gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. I felt the last of the Philip Bannerman who sought peace wither away. The man remaining was made of reinforced steel and a cold, measuring rage. I didn't need a map to find Julian anymore. I just needed to survive long enough to dismantle him. The video loaded with an agonizing crawl, the progress bar a countdown to a heartbreak I wasn't prepared for. I stared at the grainy low-light flicker of the video notification on Audrey's phone in the dimly lit dining room, my breath hitching as the pixels began to align into a recognizable shape. The progress bar on the video message crawled like a parasite across the screen. I watched it knowing that once that play button was hit, the last shreds of my son's humanity would likely vanish into the static. When the footage finally stuttered to life, it wasn't Julian's face that appeared. It was my 10-year-old grandson Leo, whose bright eyes usually held nothing but wonder, now staring through the grainy video feed, with a hollow, terrified pleading. He was sitting in a concrete windowless room, the gray walls weeping with dampness. The sound of Leo's sniffling echoed through the phone speaker, a wet, rhythmic misery that tore through my clinical composure. "Grandpa, please," he whimpered, looking off camera, as if reading from a script being held by a ghost. "Mommy says you're very sick. She says you're confused and that I have to help save the family. She says I have to find the numbers from the safe in your office." I felt the cold, smooth glass of the phone screen against my thumb as I gripped the device so hard I thought it might shatter. Leo wasn't just a hostage. He was being weaponized, his innocence dismantled to serve as a crowbar for my safe. Julian and Vanessa had poisoned the well, brainwashing the boy into believing his grandfather was a dangerous lunatic. "That's not just a basement, Audrey," I whispered, my voice thick with protective rage. "Look at the exposed conduit on the wall and the way that floor drain is graded. That's a commercial structure, maybe industrial. They aren't just taking the land, Dad. They're taking the boy's mind." The screen went black. The silence that followed was a physical weight pressing the air out of my lungs until I tasted copper. I reached out and tapped the screen, rewinding the last few seconds of the feed. I needed to see what was behind the boy. The video ended with Vanessa's manicured hand reaching into the frame to pull the camera away, her crimson nails a sharp contrast against the dull concrete. But just before the light cut, I saw it, a bright orange surveyor's transit case tucked into the shadows of a corner. It was my case, the one I thought was tucked safely in the corner of my garage. "They've been inside our home for weeks, Audrey. They've been stealing more than just papers. They've been auditing my entire life." I utilized the pause button to analyze the grainy reflection in a metallic surface behind Leo. It was a polished steel plate on a heavy machinery casing. In the distortion, I could see a silhouette holding a portable work light. It was Julian. He wasn't just the financier of this nightmare, he was the cameraman directing his son's terror for a better angle. Vanessa's kindness was a velvet glove over a hand made of rusted scrap metal. I had let her polish my life while she was busy cutting the brakes. I looked at the black screen and felt a shift in my own internal structure. The architect who built a family was gone. The inspector who looked for the point of total collapse had taken his place. Martha joined us in the kitchen, her face pale as the smell of stale coffee and early morning rain drifted through the open window. She had overheard the audio, but her mind was stuck on a different stress point. "She spent 2 hours in there, Philip," she said, her voice trembling as she leaned against the counter. "Last week, when Vanessa insisted on cleaning and organizing our primary bathroom, I thought she was just being fussy about the labels. She said our medicine cabinet was a mess and that a man with my heart condition needed a better system. The epiphany hit me like a structural failure. Every detail of the sabotaged vitamin K pills we'd found in the SUV now had a source. Vanessa wasn't being a helpful daughter-in-law. She was performing a reconnaissance of my medical vulnerabilities. She was labeling my execution method, ensuring that when the chase pushed my heart to the limit, I would reach for the very thing that would turn my blood to lead. Julian provided the access, the keys to the house I'd built for him, but Vanessa provided the lethal precision. How do you unlove a son? How do you look at the child you held in the delivery room and see a man who would let his own mother find his father's cold body? It is a question that has no answer. Only a cold, hardened resolve that began to calcify in my chest. The grief was a luxury I could no longer afford. I took the phone from Audrey and enlarged the final frame of the video, focusing on the metallic reflection I had seen earlier. There, etched into the side of a heavy iron casing, was a series of numbers. It was a serial number on an industrial pumping station valve. My hands were steady for the first time since yesterday, the familiar language of machinery providing a calm that family could no longer offer. I know that valve number. I whispered, my eyes locking onto the digits. I inspected that facility 10 years ago. It's the Sector 14 pumping station on the northern edge of the county. It's an iron beast crouching on a limestone shelf that most people have forgotten exists. They think they've found a ghost town where no one will look. They have no idea that I'm the one who drew the original blueprints for the structural retrofitting. I know every crawl space, every blind spot in the security perimeter, and every rusted bolt in that building. Julian was always too bored to listen to my stories about work, too busy looking for a shortcut to notice the details. He's chosen the one place in Pennsylvania where I am the absolute master of the environment. I looked at Martha and Audrey, seeing my own surgical focus reflected in their eyes. The blueprints for Sector 14 were locked in my memory, a map of weaknesses that Julian had never bothered to learn. We weren't just going to find Leo. I was going to dismantle the bridge they thought they were crossing to my grave. The blueprints for Sector 14 were locked in my memory, a map of weaknesses that Julian had never bothered to learn. I pulled up the old structural ledger for Sector 14 on Audrey's screen, the digital pages turning with a snap that sounded like a bone breaking in the quiet of the office. I didn't just need to find where Julian was. I needed to find the exact pressure point that would make his entire operation crumble. As a bridge inspector, I spent my career looking for the one rusted bolt or hairline fracture that could bring down tons of steel. Now, I was looking for the flaw in my own bloodline. The entry twist hit me as Audrey bypassed the final layer of encryption on the business drive. The $820,000 debt Julian was carrying wasn't a result of his poor management alone. The records showed the loans were initiated by Vanessa using Julian's future inheritance as the primary bait for Vance Capital. She hadn't just married into the family, she had mortgaged us before the wedding cake was dry. I watched the numbers scroll by, a relentless column of interest and penalties that made my stomach churn with a stunned analytical disgust. Julian didn't just make a mistake, he invited a parasite into the family tree that was now prepared to devour the roots. The Highland parcel wasn't the goal, Audrey. It was just the first payment on a bill we never signed for. $820,000. Dad, Audrey whispered, her face pale in the light of the monitor. He didn't just lose the business. He sold the name Bannerman to a shark. I leaned in, my eyes catching the name Vance Capital again and again. Vance doesn't want the money, Audrey. He wants the limestone rights under the ridge. Julian is just the key to the gate. I felt the metallic taste of old coffee in my mouth, bitter and cold. $800,000. That's not a number. It's a weight. It's the sound of a bridge cable snapping under a load it was never meant to carry. My son had allowed himself to be tethered to a monster, and he was dragging all of us into the abyss with him. Audrey's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up a secondary dossier on Garrett Vance. The man was a ghost in the legal system, but a giant in the world of predatory asset stripping. We sat in the hum of the cooling fans, reading through a history of mysterious accidents that occurred precisely when property owners refused to sign over their deeds to Vance's shell companies. "Look at this," Philip Audrey said, pointing to a scanned news clipping. A developer in Scranton tripped down his cellar stairs 2 days after refusing to sell to Vance Capital. His family signed the transfer papers a week after the funeral. I felt a deepening dread, a lethal urgency that made my fingers twitch. He's a ghost, Audrey. He doesn't leave fingerprints, he just leaves grieving families and signed contracts. I thought of the vitamin K in my center console, the meticulous way the foil had been sliced. This wasn't a desperate plan hatched in a basement. It was a corporate executioner's standard operating procedure. Julian wasn't just my son anymore. He was the inside man for a professional enforcer. How do you tell a mother that the boy she carried for 9 months has been carrying a price tag on his father's head for 12 years? I looked toward the kitchen where Martha was trying to rest, and the thought was a physical blow to my chest. I had spent my life inspecting the safety of the public, yet I had failed to see the rot in the person who sat at my own dinner table. I kept digging through the subfolders until I found a hidden PDF titled Primary Guarantee. I opened it, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. It was a secret life insurance policy Julian had taken out on me 3 years ago. The payout was exactly $820,000 plus a rider for accidental death. I am worth more to him as a corpse than a father. I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a well. He didn't just want the land, he wanted the insurance to clear the books. The realization was heart-shattering, yet it brought a tactical hardening I hadn't felt since the early days of my career. He isn't coming for the folder anymore, Dad, Audrey said, her voice shaking. He's coming to collect on the policy. The industrial envelope Julian was holding on the porch, it wasn't just land deeds. It was likely the final release forms, the ones that Leo was being used to extract the safe codes for. I wasn't looking at a son. I was looking at a ledger. And I was the only line item Julian wanted to delete. The final twist lay buried in a payroll archive Audrey unearthed. Julian wasn't just a debtor. He had been listed as an associate on Vance Capital's payroll for 12 years. The timeline was perfect. He hadn't just been struggling. He had been an active participant in Vance's predatory empire since he left college, learning how to scout properties and identify the stress points of aging owners. He had been practicing on us for over a decade, waiting for the Highland parcel to reach peak value. The dawn birds started to chirp outside, a cheerful sound that mocked the darkness in the room, and the dry electronic smell of the overheating laptop. I stood up the chair, scraping harshly against the floor. I closed the laptop, the screen light dying on my face like the last of my illusions. He didn't just bet the house, Audrey. He bet my heartbeat. And I think it's time he learns that a Bannerman heartbeat doesn't stop just because a contract says it should. I felt a surge of cold, lethal resolve. Julian thought he knew Sector 14 because he had a key to the gate. He didn't realize that I knew every rusted bolt and shifting stone of that facility. If he wanted to settle the ledger, we would do it on my terms, in a place where I was the only one who truly understood the architecture of the environment. The garage door groaned as I pulled the chain, exposing the tools of a trade that Julian thought I had forgotten how to use. I pulled the tarp off my old surveyor's kit, and the scent of cold oil and brass hit me like a forgotten promise. Julian thought I was a retired old man waiting for a stroke. He forgot that I spent 40 years learning how to find the crack that brings the whole mountain down. I ran my fingers over the heavy yellow casings of the laser levels and the worn leather of my field books. These weren't just instruments of measurement anymore. They were the components of a counterstrike. Audrey and Martha stood in the doorway, their shadows long and thin against the concrete floor, as the morning sun struggled to pierce the gathering storm clouds. I began to meticulously inspect the gear, checking the calibration of the optics and the charge on the batteries. I laid out the topographical prints of Sector 14, the paper stiff and cold under my touch. I'm not going there to argue with him. Martha, I said, my voice steady, reflecting a calm I hadn't felt in days. I'm going there to show him what happens when you build on a foundation of rot. I explained the concept of shear stress to them, pointing at the structural diagrams of the pumping station. It sits on a limestone shelf that's inherently unstable. Julian thinks he's found a fortress, but I know he's standing on a trapdoor. I packed specific industrial-grade tools, heavy-duty pry bars, and high-tensile wire items Julian wouldn't recognize as weapons until it was too late. A laser level doesn't care about your feelings. It doesn't care if you're a father or a victim. It only cares about the truth of the line. And Julian's line was crooked from the start. Philip, take the satellite phone, Audrey insisted, pressing the rugged device into my hand. If the storm takes the towers, you'll be blind. I nodded, sliding the phone into a pocket of my high-visibility vest. The neon fabric felt like a suit of armor, a return to a version of myself that was certain and immovable. Martha stepped in front of the garage door, blocking my path. You're not just going as an Inspector Philip, you're going as a father. If you see a chance to end this without a surveyor's map, you take it. Bring our grandson home. I revealed a detail then that I had kept buried for years, the limestone fault data. When the county digitized the records a decade ago, I intentionally left the most critical stability readings out of the public server. It was my private failsafe, a surveyor's secret. I am the only person on Earth who knows that the station's foundation is a ticking bomb, and right now the rain is winding the clock. Before I explain what that fault line truly means for everyone at the station, are you still with me? Choose one if you think I should use the mountain to bury the threat. Or two, if I should only use it as a distraction to get Leo out and tell me one short reason why. A quick note, the next part includes some fictionalized details, added to deepen the emotional impact and convey the core message. What matters is the lesson behind it. If this dramatization isn't for you, you're free to stop here. I spread the Sector 14 blueprints across the workbench, the white lines glowing under the shop light. I began mapping the impact zone, identifying the abandoned pumping station's fatal flaw. It was a limestone fault line I documented 40 years ago, a jagged vein of weakness that was never reinforced during the 2012 retrofitting, because the budget had been siphoned off elsewhere. I plotted the exact coordinates where the runoff from the current storm would pool, creating a hydraulic wedge. If a specific weight like a moving SUV hit the stress point on the lower access ramp, it could trigger a localized collapse of the ravine floor. I realized that Vance likely chose this spot for its isolation, thinking the concrete walls made it a bunker. He has no idea the ground beneath them is a geological trap. My mind was no longer that of a grieving parent. It was fully that of a bridge inspector, finding the one rusted bolt that holds the world together. Look at the drainage patterns on this ridge, I told Audrey, tracing the blue lines with a calloused finger. The station is sitting on a shelf of wet crackers. You're not going to just get Leo out. She whispered, her eyes wide as she saw the math. You're gonna drop the whole ridge on them, aren't you? Have you ever looked at a map and seen a graveyard instead of a landscape? Because that's what Sector 14 was to me now. A place where my family went to die, or where I went to be reborn. The storm intensified the low, vibrating rumble of thunder, echoing through the garage like a warning. I insisted on going alone. My medical history, the very thing Julian tried to use to eliminate me, was now my greatest tactical advantage. Julian won't shoot a dying man on sight. He'll want to gloat to see me sign those papers before my heart gives out. I saw the nurse in Martha's eyes as she looked at me in unspoken acknowledgement of the lethal stakes. I've spent my life making sure things don't fall down, Martha, I said, checking the sat phone one last time. Just this once, I need to be the one who makes sure they do. Come back with my grandson Philip, she replied, her voice cracking for the first time. Or don't come back at all. I climbed into the SUV, the interior smelling of stale coffee and the cold grit of the blueprints. I discovered a recorded voicemail from Julian on the sat. Phone from 3 days ago, a message I'd missed in the chaos. I can't stop Vanessa. His voice pleaded thin and desperate. Dad, please don't come. I listened to it once and deleted it. A fleeting moment of humanity was just another structural flaw I couldn't afford to account for. The garage door shut. The world turned gray. The hunt was no longer behind me. It was waiting at the top of the ridge. The rhythmic slapping of windshield wipers against the heavy rain was the only pulse I cared about now. I crested the final ridge of Black Ridge County, and there it was, the Sector 14 pumping station. A rusted iron beast crouching on a shelf of limestone that was already starting to scream under the weight of the rain. The metal rungs bit into my palms like frozen teeth. Every inch I climbed the station groaned a 200-ton beast of iron and concrete, shuddering on a limestone shelf that was rapidly turning to soup beneath us. The rusted exterior ladder of the pumping station vibrated under my boots, a skeletal spine leading into the heart of the beast. I could taste the iron in the air mixed with the sharp ozone scent of a storm that was trying to tear the sky apart. My heart, the very thing my son had tried to weaponize against me, hammered a rhythmic protest against my ribs, but I ignored it. I was no longer a victim or a patient. I was an architect returning to a structure I knew better than my own reflection. I reached the narrow maintenance catwalk circling the upper level, the wind howling through the corrugated metal like a choir of the damned. I paused, pressing my back against the wet siding to catch my breath. I took my high-visibility vest and turned it inside out, the dull gray lining making me vanish into the shadows of the machinery. This was my terrain. Peering through a section of reinforced grime-streaked glass, I finally saw them. The interior of the station was bathed in the sickly blue flicker of a laptop screen and a single industrial work light. Leo was there tied to a central concrete pillar, his small frame hunched in terror. Julian was pacing frantically near a makeshift workstation, his hands blurring as he typed. Garrett Vance sat in a folding chair, a man whose expensive suit looked like armor and whose eyes held the flat predatory stillness of a shark in shallow water. He was meticulously checking the mechanism of a high-tensile industrial bolt gun, the metal clicking with a lethal rhythmic precision. "I can't get the encryption to bypass," Julian shouted, his voice cracking with a desperation that made my stomach turn. "The server isn't responding." Vance didn't even look up from his weapon. "That's because the person who owns the keys is currently a ghost, Julian. Ghosts don't have passwords. Focus on the drive." I watched my son, the boy I had raised to respect the integrity of a foundation, groveling before, a man who specialized in hollowing them out. How many years had I spent teaching Julian that the most important part of any structure was the stuff you couldn't see, the foundation, the intent. Now I was looking at the rot I'd let fester in my own bloodline. The entry twist was a bitter pill to swallow. Julian truly believed I was dead. He wasn't just hiding, he was mourning the loss of a passcode, not a father. He was genuinely convinced the forged certificate had ended my existence, making my presence on the other side of that glass a haunting in the making. I moved silently along the catwalk, my boots finding the solid points of the steel where the vibration was least likely to betray me. I identified the emergency manual release for the upper ventilation door, a heavy iron slab that led directly into the main floor. I calculated the structural load in my head, noting the way the storm's vibration had already weakened the door's hinges. Lightning ripped through the gray sky, and for a split second, I saw Vance's face clearly. It wasn't the face of a businessman. It was the face of a machine that had run out of oil. The cold rain slicked my face as I flashed back to that shadow in the diner from weeks ago. It hadn't been a ghost. It had been one of Vance's scouts measuring me for this moment. I reached for my heavy surveyor's tripod, which I had strapped to my back. It wasn't a tool for measuring today. I extended the telescopic legs, locking them into place to create a high-leverage pry bar. You said once we had the boy, the old man would roll over. Julian whined, his shadow dancing grotesquely against the concrete. The old man is dead, Julian. Vance replied, his tone clinical. You saw the certificate. Now focus. I wedged the foot of the tripod into the strike plate of the iron door, feeling the cold, gritty metal bite deep. I wasn't just breaking in. I was performing a surgical breach of the cage they had built for my grandson. The steel door didn't just open. It surrendered. It gave up the ghost just like I had. But unlike the door, I was coming back with a vengeance. I positioned myself, calculating the exact stress point of the deadbolt. With one powerful, calculated kick, I sent the tripod lunging forward. The metal shrieked as the bolt sheared off like a dry twig. I burst into the room, the door slamming against the interior wall with a sound like a cannon blast. The sudden intrusion created a vacuum of silence, broken only by the howl of the wind and Leo's muffled, heart-wrenching sob. I stood framed by a sudden flash of lightning, my gray-lined vest making me look like a figure carved from the storm itself. Julian froze, his face going the color of ash. Dad? No, how are you here? I stepped forward, the smell of industrial grease and wet concrete thick in my lungs. A bridge doesn't just disappear because you sign a piece of paper. Julian, I said, my voice is cold as the rain outside, and neither do I. I didn't look at Julian. I looked at Leo, seeing the spark of hope ignite in the boy's eyes. But as I took another step, the power reversal was instantaneous. Vance didn't flinch. He didn't look surprised. He simply shifted his weight and turned the heavy bolt gun toward Leo's temple instead of me. Perfect timing, mastermind, Vance whispered, giving me a smile that was nothing but teeth. We were just looking for a witness. The air in the station was thick with the smell of wet concrete and my son's cowardice. I didn't look at the gun. I looked at Leo, trying to project every ounce of structural stability I had left into the boy's trembling frame. His eyes were wide, fixed on me with a desperate, silent plea that cut deeper than any physical blade. I stood in the shattered doorway, my hands raised slowly to chest height. I wasn't empty-handed. Clutched in my right hand was a thick leather-bound ledger, its edges worn and its weight substantial. This was the mastermind's gambit, the final piece of theater in a life I was ready to trade for the boy's safety. Julian was always better at spending money than understanding how it is protected. Mr. Vance, I said, my voice projecting a calm authority I didn't entirely feel. He thought the keys were digital. He thought he could just hack his way into my life. But I'm an old-school inspector. I believe in hard copies and physical locks. Julian looked at me, his face a twitching mask of confusion and greed. Dad, you have it. Vance's eyes flickered from Leo to the book. He looked at the ledger the way a starving man looks at a steak. He didn't see a book. He saw the exit ramp from a life of professional asset stripping. He saw the decryption keys to the offshore millions he had been promised, keys that Julian's frantic typing had failed to produce. I took a slow, deliberate step into the main floor, moving toward an industrial spool table that sat like a rusted altar between us. I had to move Vance's focus. I had to pull that cold steel muzzle away from Leo's temple. The entry twist was a lie I had crafted with surveyor's precision. I told them the master keys were never digital. I explained that I had converted every liquid asset into physical gold bullion held in a private vault that required my literal thumbprint and the handwritten codes in this ledger to access. I watched the power dynamics shift in real time. Vance's mockery of Julian's technical incompetence was sharp and cruel. He began to look at my son, not as a partner, but as a liability, a useless middleman who didn't even know where the real treasure was buried. "Give me the book, old man," Vance growled, though the bolt gun lowered just an inch following the arc of the leather-bound prize. "Or the boy gets a permanent structural realignment." I reached the table and placed the ledger down with a heavy thud. Julian was babbling now, his voice a pathetic whine. "Dad, please, just give it to him. Everything goes back to normal once the debt is cleared. We can go home." I looked at him, and the disgust was a cold weight in my gut. Nothing will ever be normal again. "Julian, you saw to that when you sliced open my medicine cabinet." Julian's hands were shaking so hard, the ledger rattled against the metal spool as he reached for it under Vance's watchful gaze. It was the sound of a man's future turning into dry leaves. I watched him, realizing that even now, with his son's life on a hair trigger, Julian was more worried about the $820,000 debt than the boy's heartbeat. It was a failure of character so absolute that it made the concrete walls around us seem flimsy by comparison. Vance stepped closer, his predatory stillness replaced by a twitch of anticipation. He wanted the keys. He wanted the end of the Bannerman problem. He didn't notice the way the storm was vibrating the limestone shelf beneath us, or the way the overhead lights were flickering with a dying orange hue. Have you ever seen the exact second a man realizes his entire inheritance is just a piece of paper telling him he isn't loved? It is a silence louder than a gunshot. Vance signaled Julian to open the book. "Go on, Julian. Let's see the keys to the kingdom." Julian fumbled with the latch, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He yanked the cover open, expecting a list of private keys and vault coordinates. Instead, he found the structural irony of a lifetime. The ledger was hollowed out a paper shell containing nothing but a single handwritten letter. It was the original disinheritance notice I had written years ago, the one I had kept in my desk, but never had the heart to send. Philip watches Julian's face transition from desperate greed to utter soul-crushing devastation as he reads the words that legally and emotionally sever him from the Bannerman legacy. "The debt doesn't die today, Julian," I whispered. "You do." The exit twist came from Vance's cold lips, a revelation that chilled the very marrow of my bones. He didn't look at the letter. He looked at me with a smirk that was a jagged fracture in the dark. "Did Julian tell you whose idea the bolt gun was?" Vance asked, his voice a low, murderous purr. "It was Vanessa. She said it doesn't leave ballistic evidence. She's the one who wanted the clean sweep Philip. Your son was just the one holding the door open." Julian looked up the betrayal by his wife, hitting him at the same moment as the rejection by his father. Vance didn't shout. He just slowly shifted his grip on the bolt gun, the high tensile piston hissing as it primed with a sharp mechanical click. The sound was like a snake's rattle in the silence of the station. "The ledger is a lie," he whispered, leaning in, until the muzzle was once again pressed hard against Leo's skin. "But the boy's skull is very real." I saw the look in Vance's eyes, the realization that the psychological game was over, and only the blood remained. He wasn't a businessman anymore. He was a machine that had been given a command to delete. I felt the floor under my boots groan, a deep tectonic warning that the limestone shelf was reaching its limit. The cold, damp air of the station swirled around us, carrying the scent of old paper and the dust of the hollowed ledger. Julian sat frozen, the disinheritance letter fluttering in his hand like a white flag of surrender. I looked at Leo one last time, trying to tell him with my eyes to get ready to run. I didn't need the book anymore. I needed the dark. I needed the structure to fail. I reached for the heavy pry bar hidden in my vest, waiting for the 1 second of chaos that would decide if any of us walked out of this iron beast alive. The first shot didn't hit skin. It hit the overhead light fixture, showering us in a rain of glass and mercury-tinted shadows. I didn't wait for the darkness to settle. I lunged for Leo, my body acting on a bridge inspector's instinct to protect the only asset that still mattered. My hands found the coarse rope binding him to the pillar, just as a second bolt hissed through the air, sparking against the concrete inches above my head. I didn't need eyes to navigate. I had the structural layout of Sector 14 etched into my marrow. I tackled Leo, pulling him toward the hollow of the machinery pits as the station was plunged into a chaotic, pulsing gloom. The smell of ozone and glass dust stung my nostrils, and a high-pitched ringing occupied the space where silence should have been. "Keep your eyes shut, Leo. Hold onto my belt and don't let go. I whispered, my voice a jagged rasp against the roar of the storm outside. I rolled us behind a heavy turbine casing, feeling the sharp, jagged cold of glass shards biting into my palms as I shielded the boy's head. In the dark, the station wasn't a building anymore. It was a metal ribcage, and we were the unwanted breath rattling between the bones. Vance's voice drifted through the blackness, devoid of emotion. You can't hide in the dark from a man who owns the shadows, Bannerman. I felt the vibration of Vance's movement through the floorboards, a heavy rhythmic confidence. I steered Leo through the narrow service channel, avoiding the exposed electrical conduits that were now sparking in the damp air like dying stars. Every flash of blue light revealed the devastation Julian had allowed: rusted gears, leaking hydraulic fluid, and the silhouette of a son who had truly lost his way. Crack. Not thunder. A bolt. It missed my ear by an inch and buried itself in the iron hatch like a spike in a coffin lid. We reached the secondary drainage hatch I had identified on the blueprints earlier, a forgotten exit meant for catastrophic overflows. I fumbled for the latch, but it was a solid block of oxidation. It was rusted shut. I reached into my vest and pulled out my surveyor's crowbar, wedging the tip into the seam. I threw the full weight of my shoulder against the steel, the metal screaming in protest, as the hinges began to shear. Julian's voice erupted from the center of the room, a frantic, high-pitched scream. "Dad, don't leave me! He's going to end me!" The sound of my son's terror was a physical blow, a hairline fracture in my resolve. But then I looked at Leo, whose small hands were white-knuckled as they gripped my belt. "You chose your side, Julian," I shouted back the hinges, finally giving way with a violent snap. "I'm choosing the boy." We tumbled out of the station and onto the muddy ridge, the Pennsylvania downpour hitting us like a wall of cold iron. The transition from the stifling grease of the station to the raw fury of the storm was a shock that nearly stopped my heart. I pulled Leo to his feet, my boots slipping on the rain-slicked limestone. Have you ever felt the earth move beneath you and realized it wasn't a tremor, but the ground itself trying to decide which one of you to swallow? First, I knew this terrain better than Julian ever would. I knew the limestone was living, shifting its weight under the hydraulic pressure of the deluge. I led Leo toward the specific limestone shelf I had mapped, the one with the deep-seated fault line. I heard the heavy rhythmic thud of boots hitting the mud behind us. Vance was coming. He wasn't running, he was tracking. "Is Dad coming?" Leo asked, his voice nearly lost to the wind. "The man following us isn't your father, Leo," I said, guiding him over a treacherous crevasse. "He's the consequence. Watch your step." The mid-twist was a bitter sting in the dark. I heard Julian's voice from the hatch shouting our location to Vance. "He's heading for the ravine, left of the pump house." My own son was providing the light for our executioner, proving that his desperation to clear his debt had finally erased every shred of paternal instinct. We reached the edge of the ravines where the shale was so loose it felt like walking on broken glass. The lightning didn't just flash, it strode across the sky, illuminating the world in a haunting strobe-like white. Every strike showed the water rushing into the sinkhole throats, the earth gasping for air. I looked back expecting to see a silhouette, but I saw something far worse. Two glowing green eyes were cutting through the rain, the exit twist that redefined the hunt. Vance had night vision optics. The darkness I had relied on to level the playing field was a lie. He wasn't tracking us by sound or luck. He was watching us walk exactly where he wanted, his movements precise and unhurried. He knew where the ledge was. He knew we were boxed in by the geography I thought I had mastered. I felt the cold realization settle in my chest, a weight heavier than the mud clinging to my boots. My tactical advantage had been dismantled by a piece of glass and a battery pack. I gripped Leo's shoulder, my fingers feeling the rapid, terrified beat of his heart through his soaked shirt. We were standing on the trigger, the limestone shelf groaning under the weight of the rain and the sins of the Bannerman family. I looked back at the green eyes standing tall against the wind. If I was going to drop this bridge, I had to make sure the load was heavy enough to break the foundation for good. The ground groaned, a deep tectonic sound that vibrated in my teeth. I wasn't just standing on a ridge anymore. I was standing on the trigger of a geological trap I had been set to spring for 30 years. I stood on the very edge of the limestone ravine, my arm clamped around Leo, pulling him tight against my chest. Rain lashed against us, turning the world into a gray, blurred landscape of mud and shale. Behind me, the green glow of Vance's night vision optics cut through the dark like the eyes of an abyssal predator. He was moving with a slow, terrifying confidence, the industrial bolt gun leveled at my head. "One more step, Vance," I shouted over the roar of the wind. "That is all the gravity needs." Vance stopped, his silhouette dark and immovable. "You think the earth cares about your contracts? It only cares about the load." He didn't understand the math of the ridge. He saw solid ground. I saw a shelf of wet crackers saturated by the storm's hydraulic pressure. As he shifted his weight to fire, the added load of his heavy frame and the vibration of the bolt gun's piston provided the final stress point. The earth didn't just open. It screamed, a sound of tearing stone that drowned out Vance's final panicked breath. The limestone shelf sheared away with a violent, sickening crack. I watched with cold detachment as Garrett Vance was swallowed by a mud-filled sinkhole, the predatory green optics vanishing into the roiling earth in a split second. I barely managed to swing Leo to a stable outcrop, my fingers digging into the wet shale, as the ground where we stood seconds ago dissolved into the abyss. Leo was shaking so hard I could feel his bones rattling against my ribs. I scrambled up the crumbling bank, dragging him away from the widening throat of the sinkhole. We reached the ridge road, our lungs burning with the scent of sulfur and churned mud. Through the deluge, I saw a set of headlights cutting through the trees, a second black truck. Vanessa. She slammed the brakes, the engine redlining as Julian emerged from the brush, covered in mud and hysterical. "Vanessa, stop. It is me." He screamed, running toward the vehicle with his arms outstretched, a pathetic figure begging for sanctuary. But Vanessa didn't slow down to let him in. Instead, she floored the accelerator, the tires spitting gravel, as she swerved directly toward her husband. She wasn't looking for a partner. She was looking to eliminate the only witness linking her to Vance's shadow bank. How do you explain to a 10-year-old that the woman who tucked him in at night just tried to turn his father into a red smear on the pavement? It was a level of depravity I hadn't fully measured. A total family collapse illuminated by the strobe of her high beams. Julian dived into the ditch, the truck missing him by inches, as Vanessa redlined the engine for a second pass. I pulled Leo deep into the brush, shielding his eyes from the sight of his mother, attempting a cold-blooded execution in the rain. Vanessa swerved for a final strike shot, but the Pennsylvania night was suddenly filled with a different kind of light. Blue and red strobes cut through the gray deluge, as multiple state trooper cruisers boxed in the ridge road. Audrey's coordinated call had finally paid off. The police sirens weren't music. They were the cold, rhythmic heartbeat of a law that had finally caught up to the rot in my basement. Officers swarmed the area, with rifles drawn, their voices booming over the thunder. Vanessa was dragged from her truck, her manicured fingers clawing at the air, as she was forced into the mud. Julian was tackled seconds later, still clutching the empty, hollowed-out ledger, like a religious relic. I stayed in the shadows of the hemlocks, holding Leo so tight I feared I might break him. Vanessa screamed that she was the one who tipped off the police a desperate mid-twist revelation intended to frame Julian for Vance's death, while she escaped with the digital assets. The betrayal was so thick, it was a physical weight in the air. You think you know betrayal? Wait until you see it illuminated by a strobe of emergency lights in a Pennsylvania downpour. I watched the officers lead my son away in chains, his face a mask of mud and greed. Even as they forced his head down into the cruiser, he was screaming at me, demanding the real codes for the vault. His addiction to the money had completely erased any remorse for his son's kidnapping. I felt Leo's small heart racing against my chest. It was the only structure in Black Ridge County that was still worth saving. The metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut marked the end of the Bannerman family as I knew it. I stood up slowly, my knees popping from the cold and the terror. The storm was finally starting to break, the heavy rain tapering off into a miserable drizzle. I emerged from the brush, carrying Leo toward the warmth of the nearest cruiser. But as I turned to follow the officers, a figure stepped into my path. Detective Hensley stood there, her face a grim mask under the brim of her hat. She didn't look at the child. She looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. "Mr. Bannerman," she said, her voice cutting through the fading sirens. "We need to talk about those shadow accounts." I looked at her, the exhausted relief I had felt moments ago turning into a new sharp dread. The physical war was won, but the legal consequences were just beginning to surface. The fluorescent lights of the precinct were going to be a different kind of storm, one that wouldn't wash anything clean. I watched Julian's cruiser pull away. His eyes locked on mine through the glass, and I realized he hadn't just tried to take my life. He had set a trap that would ensure I went down with him. I was the architect, and the law was about to inspect every single one of my cracks. The fluorescent lights of the precinct were a different kind of storm, one that didn't wash anything clean. I sat in a plastic chair, my hands still stained with ridge mud and the blood of a son I no longer recognized. The air smelled of industrial floor wax and burnt coffee, a sterile contrast to the wild chaos I had just escaped. Detective Hensley, a woman in her late 40s with eyes that had seen too many family tragedies, sat opposite me with clinical detachment. She didn't offer a blanket or water. Instead, she placed a thick manila folder on the table. The sound of it hitting the laminate was like a gavel striking wood. "Mr. Bannerman," she began, her voice low and level, "we've been looking for the architect of a very specific financial labyrinth for a long time. I thought we were chasing a ghost, but it turns out ghosts leave very distinct paper trails." She opened the folder, revealing bank statements I had never seen. "These are shadow accounts, Philip. They were opened 12 years ago using your social security number and your primary retirement fund as the original collateral." I reached out, my fingers hovering over the documents. My heart gave a painful thud against my ribs. "I didn't open these, detective. I've never even seen this bank's logo before." Hensley didn't flinch. "Your signature is on every digital authorization, Mr. Bannerman. And the money, nearly $500,000 over the last decade, was moved from your home IP address." "Small amounts," she added, using my own professional vocabulary against me. "Like removing a single rivet from a bridge every month. You don't notice the damage until the whole thing starts to lean." I felt my financial foundation liquefying. Every year I had spent working every bridge I had inspected had been used as camouflage for a decade-long crime. Julian hadn't just stolen my present. He had been harvesting my past for years. Hensley revealed that Julian had been providing evidence to the police for months, claiming I was the one pressuring him into these shadow bank loans. He had set me up as the fall guy before the first black truck ever appeared on Ridge Road. Hensley leaned forward. "Here is our working theory, Philip. You're a surveyor. You know how to make things look solid while the core is rotting. You used Julian as a front man to interact with Garrett Vance because you knew a 40-year-old with debt looked more suspicious than a 68-year-old with a pension." I stared at her mouth hanging open in indignant terror. "I was trying to stay alive. I was saving my grandson." Hensley tapped the folder. "Then explain the tactical escape, the ghost signal, phone diversion, your knowledge of the fire roads. Most victims panic and call 911. You performed an evasive maneuver that would make a cartel lieutenant proud. You didn't drive like a grandfather. You drove like a man who knew exactly how to disappear." I realized the horrific irony of my situation. My professional background, my ability to find stress points and navigate unmapped terrain, was being interpreted as the MO of a professional criminal. How do you prove you're a victim when your own survival instincts look like a confession? The door opened and Audrey stepped in. She looked exhausted, eyes red-rimmed. "Dad, they're not listening," she whispered. "The police found the jimmied back door at my house. They don't think it was Vance. They think you staged the break-in to destroy the laptop and the local logs of those shadow accounts." I looked at my daughter and saw the fear in her eyes. It was the ultimate structural failure of my life as a father. I had spent 12 years keeping Julian's small lies secret to maintain peace. I had enabled the rot because I was too afraid to see the fracture. Now that habit of silence provided the police with the perfect motive for my supposed complicity. "I built this cage myself, didn't I?" I asked. Every time I looked away from Julian's lies, I was just adding another bar. The handcuffs didn't click, not yet. But the silence was doing the work of iron and steel. The ghost signal I had used to blind Vance's men was now being presented by the district attorney as proof of my intent to flee jurisdiction. My smartest move, the one that saved Martha and me, had been reframed as the flight of a guilty mastermind. Detective Hensley slid a final photo across the table. It was a close-up of the jimmied lock on Audrey's back door. "The marks on the strike plate match the specific gauge of your surveyor's crowbar, Mr. Bannerman," she said. "The one we found in your SUV. Care to tell me why you were breaking into your own daughter's home?" I stared at the photo, the image blurring as the room seemed to spin. I had become the architect of my own demise. My tools used to build my gallows. I looked at my hands, the mud still under my fingernails, and realized the law didn't care about the man I was. It only cared about the bridge I had helped Julian build to hell. I hadn't just been hunted on that ridge. I had been built to fall long before I ever turned that ignition key. I looked at the grocery store clerk, my credit card, a useless piece of plastic between my fingers, and realized the freezing of my life had begun. The cashier looked at me with pity and suspicion as the terminal emitted a sharp red-lighted rejection. "I'm sorry, sir," she said. "It says, refer to issuer." I tried a second card, then a third, but the result was the same. I left the cart full of groceries and walked out into the humid Pennsylvania afternoon. I felt hollowed out by a system that had once been my bedrock. I drove straight to my local bank branch, where the manager Dave usually greeted me by my first name. But when I stepped into his office, the warmth was gone. "I'm sorry, mister." "Bannerman," Dave said, eyes fixed on a computer monitor. "Until the federal racketeering investigation is cleared, we cannot authorize any withdrawals." "I've banked here for 40 years, Dave. You know me." I watched him swallow hard. "We thought we did, Philip." The humiliation was a physical weight. We were reduced to the small pile of cash Martha had hidden in a flour jar, a handful of $20 bills that felt like a mockery of our decades of saving. The morning mail brought a certified envelope. It was a notification from the state licensing board. My professional license as a bridge inspector and surveyor was suspended indefinitely effective immediately pending the criminal outcome of the Bannerman Shadow Network. I sat at my desk surrounded by the wall of certifications I had earned through sweat and precision. "Everything I built, Martha, it's all classified as criminal expertise now. I'm no longer an inspector. I'm a liability report waiting to be filed." My son hadn't just stolen my money. He had subverted my professional credentials to certify rot. I looked at my surveyor's transit and felt the crushing weight of the enabler's karma. My 12 years of choosing peace over truth regarding Julian's smaller lies had finally cost me my professional honor. "Julian knew exactly where to cut, didn't he?" Martha said, standing in the doorway. "He didn't just want the money. He wanted to hollow you out." As I began auditing my own professional logs to find proof of my innocence, I discovered a series of project sign-offs I never authorized. Julian had been using my digital surveyor credentials for the last 18 months to approve substandard construction materials for Vance's various development projects. I wasn't just a suspect in a fraud case. I was legally liable for potential structural failures across 3 counties. My expertise had been used to certify rot. I wasn't just losing my past. Julian had rigged my future to explode. The house was too quiet. Martha and I sat in the darkened living room that evening, the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock the only heartbeat left. "How did we not smell the rot, Philip?" she finally asked. "Were we that desperate to be loved?" I looked at her, seeing the same reflection of failure in her eyes. "I kept replacing the rusted bolts, Martha. I never thought to look at the ground beneath the bridge. We had raised a viper in our own garden, feeding it with our silence and calling our cowardice family loyalty. We were the primary accomplices to our own destruction." The silence was broken by a small, dry clicking sound. Martha stood and walked to the bed, her fingers tracing the edge of the mahogany headboard. She reached into the narrow gap between the wood and the wall and pulled out a small, matte black disc. It was a hidden recording device. Martha held it up, her hand trembling. "They weren't just waiting for us to die, Philip," she whispered. "They were listening to us plan our retirement. They were listening to every private doubt, every mention of the safe codes, and every word of love we had shared. The violation was absolute. Vanessa hadn't just cleaned our bathroom. She had bugged our intimacy. I took the disc from her, feeling like a piece of shrapnel. My son had turned my bedroom into a listening post. "Philip," Martha said, her voice hardening, "what do we do?" I looked at the county jail's address on the legal papers. "We go to the source," I said. I was done being the inspector. I was ready to be the evidence. The courthouse steps felt like the ascent to a gallows I'd built with my own hands. I didn't go there for justice. I went to see if there was a single spark of my son left behind the eyes of the man who tried to bury me. The air inside the Blackridge County Courthouse was heavy, saturated with the smell of floor polish and the ancient brooding scent of heavy oak. I walked slowly, the cold, hard pressure of the wooden gallery bench already calling to my spine before I even reached courtroom 4B. Beside me, Martha was a shadow of herself, the sharp, stinging salt of her silent tears, leaving tracks through the exhaustion on her face. We took our seats in the third row, a position that felt like a target. The entry twist arrived before the judge even took the bench. Julian's high-priced defense attorney stood and announced to the court that my son had officially turned state's evidence. He wasn't just pleading, he was testifying. He claimed that every illegal shadow account, every wire transfer, and every predatory loan was done under my direct supervision. He was painting me as the architect of the Bannerman Shadow Network, casting himself as the mere tool of a coercive patriarch. He wasn't just shifting blame, he was handing me the entire weight of it. Every word his attorney spoke wasn't a defense. It was an offer, a clean narrative where I would carry the structure and he would walk away from the collapse. I saw it then with brutal clarity. This wasn't about surviving the case. It was about choosing who would be buried under it. I felt my lungs constrict, the betrayal so thick, it was a physical obstruction. The side door creaked open, and Julian was led into the room. He was a shock in orange, his frame shackled, and the rhythmic metallic clinking of his chains echoing against the high ceilings. As he passed the gallery, he didn't hang his head. He didn't look away in shame or avoid my gaze. Instead, he caught my eye and delivered a slow, deliberate smirk. That look wasn't defiance. It was confirmation. He wasn't hoping I'd break, he was waiting for it, waiting for me to understand that every step I had taken to protect him had led me exactly where he needed me to be. It was a chilling expression, one that held no remorse, only a sense of twisted accomplishment. "Look at him," Philip Martha whispered, her voice barely a thread. "He's not even sorry." I gripped the edge of the bench until the wood bit into my palms. "He's not looking for forgiveness, Martha. He's looking for the next weak point. A courtroom is just a bridge under a different name. It's built on the assumption that the truth is a solid foundation. But when the truth is a sinkhole, everyone falls." Julian didn't look like a man in trouble. He looked like a predator who had finally managed to trap the one thing he feared most, the man who knew who he really was. The bail hearing quickly turned into a firestorm. The prosecution outlined the assault at the pumping station and the massive fraud, but Julian's attorney was ready. He presented leaked internal memos, documents I had never seen, suggesting I had used Julian as a digital proxy for illegal investments for over a decade. The attorney, a man whose smile held all the warmth of a surgical tray, pointed a finger directly at the gallery. "My client was merely a tool, Your Honor. The architect of this entire financial labyrinth sits right there in the third row. A man who knows how to hide stress points. A man who spent 40 years measuring the world just so he could learn how to deceive it." I felt the weight of the public gaze in the courtroom, the collective judgment of the community I had served for 40 years. They didn't see a grieving father. They saw a criminal mastermind who had corrupted his own flesh and blood. That's a lie I wanted to shout. I spent my life making sure things were safe. But the silence of the court was absolute, and my indignation felt like a confession in that hollow air. Have you ever seen the light die in someone's eyes and realized it wasn't a tragedy, but a choice? Julian didn't stumble into the dark. He walked in and locked the door behind him. The judge listened with a face carved from granite. When the gavel finally hit the wood crack, the sound was the final splintering of our family tree into toothpicks. Bail was denied. The guards moved in to turn Julian back toward the holding cells. As he stood, he leaned slightly toward the gallery. He didn't say it out loud, but I saw his lips move. He mouthed a single word: mastermind. He wasn't playing a role for the judge anymore. He was embracing the lie to destroy me from the inside out. I watched the heavy metal door close behind him, and a profound funereal silence settled over my heart. "I didn't lose a son today, Martha." I said the words feeling as cold as the limestone on the ridge. I lost a ghost. The Julian who cried over broken toys, the boy I had taught to fish and survey, was truly dead. The man who remained was a structural ruin, a hollow shell that could never be repaired. We stood up the oak benches, creaking in the wake of our grief. Martha's hand was a cold weight in mine, but the birth of a new hard defiance was starting to take hold in the center of my chest. Then I saw it. Just before Julian had turned to leave, the light from the tall courtroom windows caught a glit on his right hand. He was wearing a specific signet ring, a heavy gold band with a dark recessed stone. It was the same ring Garrett Vance had worn. The identity reveal was a punch to the gut. Julian hadn't just worked for the shadow bank, he had been promoted within their hierarchy, even while sitting in a county cell. He wasn't a victim of Vance, he was a successor. As the courtroom cleared, the silence felt less like a funeral and more like a survey site. I looked down at my hands and saw the digital timestamp on my watch flickering as it synced with the local tower. My mind trained for 40 years to look for the one error that collapses the whole, suddenly locked onto a detail Julian couldn't erase. He had stolen my past and mortgaged my future, but he had missed one structural error, a timestamp on a forged document that would prove I was still alive when he said I was dead. I looked at the metal door where Julian had vanished. I wasn't done being the architect yet, but I was done being the victim. I remembered the one flaw he couldn't hide, the one piece of precision that would destroy his defense and clear the Bannerman name for good. For the first time since that road, I wasn't reacting to what Julian had built. I was looking for the fault line inside it. Because if he had spent years turning me into the perfect scapegoat, then somewhere in that design, he had made the one mistake he couldn't survive. The visitor's booth was a cage of glass and reinforced concrete. I didn't sit there as a father looking for a son. I sat there as a surveyor looking at a structural ruin beyond repair. I walked through the high-security buzzers of Blackridge County Jail, carrying a manila envelope heavier than my old surveyor's kit. The sharp smell of floor stripper hung in the stale air. Across the thick glass, Julian appeared in the orange, his jumpsuit screaming against gray walls. He sat down with a slow, deliberate smirk, still playing the mastermind who had outplayed his old man. I remained silent for a full minute, watching the tiny tremors in his hands. I had spent 40 years looking for micro-vibrations that preceded collapse, and I saw them now. "You're still smirking, Julian," I said, my voice cold. "That's the problem with people who don't understand foundations. They think the fall is the fun part." Julian's laugh was hollow through the speaker. "I'm going to walk out of here on your retirement fund, Dad. You're just a ghost in the system now. Vanessa and I have the paperwork. You're legally dead and buried." This was never about escape, was it? It was about transfer. You didn't just want out, you wanted me in your place. Every account in my name, every document tied to my life. It was all positioned so when this collapsed, I'd be the one buried under it. I wasn't your father anymore. I was your contingency plan. I watched him lean back, the smugness surfacing when he realized I wasn't there to beg for Leo's safety. He admitted it then, his voice dropping into a dark register. "I didn't just swap those pills, Dad. I intentionally left the real meds on the counter because I knew you'd run. I wanted the abandonment to do the work for us. You didn't panic that night. You calculated it. Every decision I thought was survival, you had already factored in. The pills, the road, the timing, none of it was chance. You didn't just plan for me to fail. You planned for me to disappear." I felt the last threads of paternal guilt snap. I reached into my envelope and pulled out a single sheet, pressing it against the glass. "You were so focused on the ink that you forgot about the electricity. Data doesn't lie, Julian. It only measures. This log shows the certificate was filed at 2:14 p.m. At that exact moment, I was executing the ghost signal diversion on the interstate. I have the dash cam footage, the cell tower pings, and the highway sensors to prove I was 5 miles away from the deathbed your notary swore to." I watched the smirk collapse into raw panic. His eyes darted across the document, searching for a flaw he couldn't find. That doesn't prove anything," he stammered. "The accounts are still in your name. I was the one who managed the safe. Winbos discount, Kafpanis." I leaned closer. "You think I'm an amateur, Julian. I had triggered a remote diagnostic check on my SUV's computer during the chase specifically to create a secondary digital breadcrumb. I knew you'd try to erase my timeline, so I made sure the car recorded every second of my survival in a way you never checked." Julian's hands began to shake violently. He realized his defense strategy had just become a confession of forgery and attempted homicide. "I have already handed the printer logs and the timestamp audit to Detective Hensley," I said, standing. "I'm not your father today, Julian. I'm the inspector who found the crack. And I'm signing the order to tear it down." Julian lunged at the glass, screaming, "Dad, come back! You can't leave me in here. Vanessa will destroy me." I didn't wait to hear the rest. I hung up the receiver, the plastic clicking with finality. I turned my back on the glass, walking away from the reflection of my own failure. The heavy steel door thudded shut behind me, and the afternoon sunlight hit my face. For the first time in 12 years, it actually felt warm. My phone buzzed. Audrey's voice trembled with relief. "Dad, the grand jury just saw the printer logs. They're asking for you. They need the final testimony." I looked toward the courthouse, the white stone gleaming like a promise. I was ready. The foundation was clear, the debris was being hauled away, and the Bannerman name was finally going to be built on something solid again. But I understood something I should have seen years ago. This wasn't the end of what Julian built. It was just the part where it started to break in the light. And somewhere inside all that precision, there was still one fracture left to expose. The grand jury room was a cathedral of accountability. I sat on the wooden witness chair, answering the prosecutor's sharp questions for hours. Detective Hensley gave me a single nod, silent acknowledgement of the distance we'd traveled. I confirmed the medical reports detailing the vitamin K sabotage, the clinical evidence of a daughter-in-law's malice. I walked the jurors through the digital printer logs Audrey had recovered, showing how the forged death certificate had been manufactured on my own equipment while I was still drawing breath. The prosecutor entered a secondary file into evidence. Through the grand jury testimony, I discovered Vanessa hadn't just been planning my end. She had taken out a secret life insurance policy on Julian too. They weren't partners in crime. They were two predators circling each other, both waiting for the other to become collateral. I've spent my life measuring stress points. I told the jurors, my voice regaining professional authority. My son didn't just forge a signature, he forged a death sentence. The data shows I was driving at the exact moment this document says I was a corpse. Truth is a stubborn material. It doesn't compress under pressure, and it doesn't melt in a fire. It just waits for the ashes to cool. I watched the jurors leaning in their faces, reflecting heavy silence as I dismantled the mastermind theory with cold precision of metadata. Every tactical move I had made to survive the ghost signal, the fire roads, the diagnostic pings stopped being evidence of guilt and became structural records of a man refusing to fall. By the time I stepped down, the vindication felt like a new foundation being poured. I waited in the courthouse hallway, the sharp blue light making everything hyper-real. Audrey sat beside me, her eyes fixed on the heavy double doors. When they finally opened, the indictment fell like a hammer. The grand jury returned a true bill for Julian and Vanessa Bannerman on charges of attempted homicide, racketeering, and grand larceny. "It's over, Dad," Audrey whispered, her voice thick with relief. "It's not over, Audrey," I replied. "It's just recorded. Justice is the paper. The damage is the building. My name was cleared, but the Bannerman family portrait was permanently shredded, leaving nothing but jagged edges of what we used to be." Late that evening, I drove back to the abandoned pumping station to recover my gear before the site was cordoned off. The storm had subsided, leaving a low hum of dripping water and wet concrete. I walked through the debris, my boots crunching on glass shards. Among the wreckage near the central pillar, I found my old brass surveyor's transit, the same one I had seen in the video of Leo, now covered in gray dust. Something felt off. The leveling screws had been tampered with, threads stripped by someone who didn't know precision tools. I unscrewed the base plate and found the central housing had been hollowed out. Inside was a roll of heavy parchment. I unrolled it and realized I was looking at a handwritten backup will Julian had drafted for Leo. It was secondary insurance against his own wife. The document detailed Julian's plan to remove Vanessa from the equation once the Highland parcel money hit, intending to frame her for Vance's crimes and leave the boy an orphan with a clean estate. The will revealed Julian had already pre-sold the Highland parcel to a different buyer than Garrett Vance, a developer from out of state, intending to double-cross the shadow bankers, just as he had. Double-crossed me. He had positioned himself against everyone building a structure where every outcome left someone else buried. "You were going to get rid of her too, Julian," I whispered to the empty room. "You weren't building a future for Leo. You were building a graveyard." I walked out onto the limestone ridge, the moon reflecting off the mud-filled sinkhole where Vance had vanished. I pulled a match from my pocket and struck it. The smell of sulfur hit me sharp and biting. I watched the first corner of the secret will catch fire. As the paper curled into black ash on the limestone ridge, I realized the only way to save Leo was to make sure he never knew the depth of the monster he called Father. Some structures are too rotten to be salvaged. The only thing left is to burn the blueprints and start over on fresh ground. The smoke from the ridge followed me home, a gray ghost of a life I was finally ready to leave behind. I walked onto Audrey's porch not as a victim or a mastermind, but as a man who had finally stopped pretending the foundation wasn't cracked. The smell of burnt paper and pine needles clung to my jacket. Audrey was there, waiting in the fading light of the afternoon, while Leo played in the yard. The boy was finally safe, his laughter a rhythmic healing sound. I sat on the wooden bench beside my daughter, the silence between us heavy with the weight of 12 years of unspoken rot. I didn't wait for her to ask. I told her everything: the early thefts I'd covered up, the manipulative behaviors I'd labeled as entrepreneurial spirit, and the sheer depth of my enabler's silence. "I thought I was being a good father by protecting him from his own mistakes, Audrey," I said, my voice sounding older than the mountains. "I didn't realize I was just building a monster." I explained how painting over rust is what truly allowed the structural collapse of our family. I confessed that my desperation to protect Julian was rooted in my own past. I had made a similar structural error early in my career that my own father had buried for me. I had been trying to pay forward a debt that was never mine to settle. "You didn't just hide the truth from us, Dad," Audrey said, her gaze fixed on Leo. "You hid it from yourself." She didn't shout. Her voice had the cold, analytical clarity of a surveyor marking a fault line. The realization that my enabling wasn't an act of love, but an act of cowardice settled into my bones like the damp evening air. Suddenly, Leo ran up to the porch, his face flushed with play. He looked at me with those bright, innocent eyes and asked the question I had been dreading. "Grandpa, when is Dad coming home from the work trip?" I looked at the boy, realizing that the merciful lie is exactly what started this entire cycle of decay. I couldn't do it again. I chose radical honesty, even though it felt like tearing out my own heart. "Lesbis," I said, pulling him close so he could feel the stability of my chest. "Your dad made some very bad choices. He won't be coming home for a long time." The boy's eyes didn't just water, they turned old. In 10 seconds he aged 10 years, and I was the one who handed him the clock. I held him until the shaking stopped. Once Audrey took him inside, a legal representative arrived to finalize the business of the Ridge. We sat in Audrey's home office, the warm light of the golden hour spilling over the desk. I had the paperwork for the Sector 9 Highland parcel spread before me. I wasn't just signing it over to Audrey, I was executing a permanent conservation trust. "If Julian can't sell it, he can't use it to feed his greed," I told the attorney. "The Ridge belongs to the Earth now, not the Bannermans." It was a clean break, a way to restore structural integrity by removing the very weight that had caused the bridge to buckle. I felt the physical sensation of the fountain pen on the paper, the cold, heavy weight of the instrument moving with finality. I watched the ink dry on the final page, the Bannerman legacy legally placed beyond my son's reach forever. The attorney gathered the documents, but before he could leave, I revealed a specific clause I had insisted upon. I had included a provision for Leo's education, but it was contingent the boy would only receive the funds if he never attempted to contact his parents until he reached the age of 25. I was building a firewall between the boy and the rot that had consumed his father. I put the pen down and looked at my reflection in the window. My name was finally cleared, the land was safe, and the monster I had helped create was caged behind steel and legal barriers. But as I turned to walk back to the living room, a final envelope arrived via a courier. It was from the county jail, the paper stamped with the facility's mark. I felt a cold prickle of dread. It wasn't from Julian. The handwriting was sharp, predatory, and unmistakably Vanessa's. The paper felt like cold skin against my fingers. I sat on Audrey's porch, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the boards. The letter arrived through a high-priced legal courier, a sign that even behind bars Vanessa's connections to the silent partners remained untouched. The paper was expensive, smuggled into her cell to send a message. I didn't want to open it, but an inspector never leaves a crack unmeasured. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't even mention Julian. Instead, she laid out the reality I had been trying to ignore. "You didn't win Philip," the letter read. "You just made the price of the land go up. Garrett Vance was just the cleanup crew, a blunt instrument for a much larger machine. The real buyers are still waiting in the tall grass of Black Ridge County, and they have more patience than a Bannerman." She warned me that a conservation trust is just a fence, and fences can be torn down by the right hands. Vanessa revealed she had established a secondary, irrevocable trust for Leo in her own name months ago, a fund fueled by the very shadow accounts I thought I'd dismantled. I cannot legally block it, and neither can the state. I felt the air around me thicken, realizing that while the main players were caged, the ecosystem of greed they lived in was still very much alive. I had spent months thinking I was dismantling a system, but systems don't end, they adapt. I needed one last look at the source of it all. I drove my SUV back up to the Sector 9 Highland Ridge as the sun began its final descent. The road was quiet, the gravel crunching under my tires with a rhythmic, lonely sound. I reached the summit and stepped out, the smell of damp limestone and evening pine, greeting me like an old, complicated friend. I walked the perimeter of the shelf, my boots tracing the edge where the earth had swallowed Garrett Vance. The sinkhole was a jagged scar in the mud, a permanent reminder of the night the foundation failed. I utilized my professional eyes to see the land not as an asset or a payday, but as a living structure. The ridge had protected me when my own blood wouldn't. "You kept your end of the bargain, didn't you?" I whispered to the rocks. "You stayed solid when everything else gave way." The ridge was silent, no sirens, no screaming. Just the sound of the wind trying to heal the wounds we'd left in the mud. I felt a somber gratitude, a spiritual closure that had been eluding me since the precinct. But as the light began to fade into twilight, a familiar shape materialized in my peripheral vision. At the mouth of the old fire road, 300 yards away, a matte black Sierra truck sat idling. Its headlights were dark, its windows opaque. My heart didn't race this time. it settled into a steady rhythm. I didn't panic. I didn't reach for my phone. I simply stood my ground on the limestone. I see you, I said, the words carried away by the cooling wind. And I'm still standing. The truck lingered for a long minute, the low vibrating rumble of its diesel engine, a predatory hum in the silence. Then slowly it began to turn. It didn't surge forward. It retreated, disappearing into the thick tree line without a sound. A chime from my dashboard interrupted the moment. A message from Audrey appeared on the screen. "Did the PI find you? He said you were heading to the ridge and he'd keep a distance." I realized the driver wasn't a hitman or a collector. He was a private investigator hired by Audrey to watch over me. The cycle of surveillance had merely shifted from malice to protective paranoia. My daughter was using the same tools as my son, but her foundation was built on fear for my safety rather than a hunger for my death. I turned back to my car, the keys heavy in my pocket. The ridge was safe for now, protected by a trust and the blood of those who tried to take it. I took one last breath of the damp evening air, feeling the weight of the project finally lift from my shoulders. The Bannerman name was a ruin, but Leo was a new build, and I would spend the rest of my days ensuring his foundation was reinforced with the truth I had finally found. As I glanced at the rearview mirror to pull away, I saw a single red light blinking in the woods. Not a camera this time, but a surveyor's beacon marking a line I hadn't drawn. The future was already being mapped by someone else, but I wasn't afraid of the boundaries. The damage doesn't end when the truth comes out, it just becomes the new terrain you have to survey every single day. I used to believe protecting my son meant covering his mistakes, but this family story taught me that silence can be the first crack in a foundation. What began as love turned into family betrayal, and I became part of the structure that allowed it to grow. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: don't ignore the small fractures because they don't heal, they spread. In this family story, I saw how unchecked loyalty can become complicity, and how family betrayal is rarely sudden, it's built layer by layer. My advice: face the truth early, even when it hurts. Don't trade integrity for temporary peace. And remember, even when everything collapses, God sees what we refuse to confront. This family story ends with scars, but also with clarity. Family betrayal doesn't define you, how you respond to it does. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. I'd really like to hear your thoughts. What would you do if you were in a situation like this? Father's impossible choice. Share your perspective in the comments. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. A quick note: while inspired by complex family conflicts and generational mistakes, some elements have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this kind of content isn't for you, feel free to explore something that fits you better.
뛴다. 아이. 거기서부터.
생칠 17님 별풍선 5개 감사합니다.
아, 지금 여기다.
깨비야,
아,
단영이
드디어.
시영이 데리고 다니느라 고생했어.
나온다. 곧 나온다. 이제 바로 나온다. 저만 들었어. 다시.
근데 언니 대박이다.
생칠 17님 별풍선 5개 감사합니다. 단양이는 돈이 없성 유유 이걸로라도 깨비용 물결표.
찌찌라.